A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
I used to think family dinners were sacred, a time when laughter echoed and memories were created, but that all changed when Uncle Greg, who has an uncanny ability to slip venomous remarks into jovial conversations, decided to comment on my smile. It was supposed to be a routine Sunday evening. My mother had spent the entire day cooking her famous lasagna while my father polished his collection of vintage wine, and the aroma normally brought me a sense of comfort. As we gathered around the oversized table, my mother's excitement was palpable as she presented the meal, her warm smile contrasting sharply with the chill that settled in the air as Uncle Greg leaned in, eyes glinting with mischief, and said, "What happened to your smile, anyway? It looks different." At that moment, a thunderbolt struck within me. My mind raced back to the summer I turned 14, the summer my childhood was ripped from me when I discovered Vine, a predator masquerading as a social media platform where I was the star of ridicule with a series of leaked videos that showcased my awkwardness and strange, crooked grin, dictated by the braces that had turned me into a target for the school bullies. Laughter had morphed into tears, and that distant, carefree girl was just a haunting memory as my smile had become a mask for my pain, a fragile shield behind which I'd concealed years of insecurity and self-loathing. I froze, feeling the eyes of my entire family on me. The youngest cousins were giggling by the dessert plates, my older sister was nervously flicking her gaze between me and my uncle, and my parents were exchanging worried looks, as if they could sense the storm brewing beneath the surface, the air thick with tension waiting to burst. Then, before I knew it, the acidic words were spilling from my mouth like a torrent. "What's wrong with my smile?" The table fell silent, forks paused midair, and for a fraction of a second, time felt suspended. Uncle Greg chuckled, half in jest and half in malice. "What happened to the girl who used to light up the room with that dorky grin?" I could see it then, the flicker of glee in his eyes as if my vulnerability nourished him. In that instant, the jubilant laughter of the evening faded into an oppressive silence, and with every ounce of grief I harbored, I vented, unleashing suppressed anger and frustration that spiraled into a whirlwind of words, attacking not just Greg but the entire facade of family gatherings, laying bare the scars that were traditionally covered with laughter. Do you think I want to be reminded of how different I am? Of the countless nights I spent crying in front of a mirror wishing to fit in? And as I spoke, it was as though a dam broke. My family members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the shock of the sudden outburst tangling their hearts in conflicting emotions. My mother looked hurt, as though I'd pulled back the curtain on a family secret, while my father, usually the peacemaker, sat, wide-eyed, surprised at the tempest that had erupted from his adoring daughter. Then it happened. My sister, usually the calmest of us all, stepped in, her face pale as she bitterly remarked, "You're not a walking tragedy. Get a grip. This is just a dinner." The words snapped like a rubber band, ricocheting through the room and into every soul present. The atmosphere shifted dramatically. What was once an ambient family gathering had transformed into a battleground where everyone was armed with unspoken feelings. It felt surreal, our laughter replaced by an awkwardness thick enough to slice. I felt lost, standing amidst the wreckage of my own emotions, the insult consuming me, gnawing at my insides. I could see my uncle's pleasure, feeding on the drama he had awakened, and it infuriated me further. Why couldn't they understand that family should be a sanctuary, a place I could shield myself from the world's cruelties? And when I finally saw my father's gaze, a mix of pity and disappointment, I realized I had crossed a line that would never be uncrossed. The dinner plates were forgotten, the clinking of utensils was replaced by my heaving breaths, and the tension became palpable, everyone holding their breath, teetering on the edge of the abyss. Then Mom, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and sorrow, finally spoke, her voice trembling, "You've ruined this dinner, all of you. Greg, you need to learn when to keep your mouth shut, and you." She turned to me, disappointment etched across her features. "You should know better than to let it get to you. We're family." I gaped, the weight of it hitting me like a freight train. I had acted out, sure, but so had Uncle Greg, yet somehow, I was the villain in this narrative. As the discomfort and hostility wrapped around us like a suffocating blanket, I felt detached, an observer in my own life, watching the family I once adored crumble under the strain of unaddressed grievances and unexpressed emotions. I stormed out, tears cascading down my cheeks as the darkened evening air hit me. I didn't hear the poker-faced exchanges or the strained whispers following my exit. I simply wrapped my arms around my knees under the stars, wondering if I had truly ruined the dinner or merely laid bare the fractures that had always lurked beneath the surface, awaiting the perfect moment to shatter our fragile facade. As the night wore on, the moon hung heavy with judgment, and deep down, I felt it, the feeling that perhaps we were all broken, cracking beneath the weight of unspoken words, yet desperate to pretend we were fine. But for one fleeting moment, amidst the chaos and heartbreak, I wished someone would have just acknowledged the depth of my hurt, instead of dismissing me as the antagonist of the family drama and making me wonder if, maybe, it was time to stop pretending those cracks didn't exist. The reality was, we each wore our own masks. Uncle Greg wore his of laughter while my family donned theirs of indifference, and that night, I unveiled mine, the one marred by hurt but precious in its truth, and I realized, maybe, the real tragedy wasn't in my smile but in the silence that had allowed them to linger. I work at a low-key diner in a small town, the kind of place that serves grease-drenched fries and all-day breakfast, where regulars come to sip overly sweetened coffee and swap gossip that echoes off the chipped linoleum. It was a job that I took out of necessity more than passion, especially since my mom had just recently fallen sick, and I had all the bills piling up at home. My coworker, Karen, is the kind of person who thrives on petty drama. She's got a knack for turning mundane requests into full-blown crises. She's also been eyeing my Wednesday morning shift, my only early day, like a hawk, but I'd made plans to take my mom to her bi-weekly therapy session, a rare opportunity for us to reconnect, as my work schedule often monopolized my life. It was during one of her endless complaints about her own commitments that she launched into a full-on crusade, convinced that I, the selfish employee, was sabotaging her chances for success. I politely declined when she first asked to swap shifts, citing my prior obligation, but that only seemed to snowball into her relentless barrage of guilt trips and passive-aggressive remarks. "You don't care about anyone but yourself," she huffed one night during closing, flicking the fryer switch off with far too much force. "Some people have real ambitions." I tried to shake off her words, but they clung to me like sweat-soaked uniforms. I thought maybe I was being unreasonable, and since people love to insist that kindness is a two-way street, I made the mistake of texting her one evening to see if we could reach some understanding, joking that I could trade my early shift for her Saturday night, which is the busiest time at the diner, hoping this would make her think twice. But Karen was relentless. She acted like I'd committed treason. Soon I was receiving messages from other co-workers, who were also under her spell, asking me why I couldn't just be a team player, to do it for the family of the diner. It started to feel like a witch hunt, but I stood firm. I couldn't lose my one chance to spend quality time with my mom. The weight of my decision hit harder one night when I overheard Karen talking in the break room, plotting ways to undermine my credibility. She painted me as the villain to anyone who'd listen, saying I was sabotaging her dreams while simultaneously tearing down my work ethic like I was the problem ruining her life. I couldn't comprehend how a simple shift swap had turned into something so twisted. Was I really the antagonist here? A part of me thought about just giving in, but the memory of my mom's face during our last appointment reminded me of what I was fighting for. A tiny but fierce part of me didn't want to grant Karen the satisfaction of having made me yield. As weeks dragged on, I noticed strange things happening. Orders would come in for tables I wasn't assigned, the ice machine would mysteriously malfunction, and patrons oohed over the burnt toast that I'd swore I never cooked. It got to a point where I almost felt like I was being bullied at my own job, a chilling sensation creeping over me that Karen had somehow turned the rest of the staff against me. One particularly chaotic Saturday, I was hit with the nausea-inducing news from my boss that I would need to take a 2-week indefinite leave due to additional training. It was a thinly veiled excuse, but I heard the laughter in Karen's eyes when I left the break room. With my heart racing, I pulled up the diner's group chat later that night, only to see Karen had shared a meme about a greedy coworker that looked suspiciously like me. The blind rage surged within me because I was sick of her games, but it wasn't until the night of my mom's treatment that everything spun out of control. Sitting in the waiting room, I suddenly received a frantic text from my coworker Sarah, warning me that Karen had taken my shift, and I knew she'd done it just to make a point. Panic gripped me, an icy hand squeezing my insides as I reflected on how low she would sink just to win a petty fight. I rushed back to the diner, yelling at the owner, but he was too mesmerized by Karen's shining performance behind the counter. I left, heartbroken and nauseated, feeling trapped in a web of everyone else's delusions. But it was that anger that eventually propelled me forward. I swore I would no longer allow anyone to dictate how I conducted my life. So with a heavy heart, I made a plan. I kept my mom's treatment notes clutched to my chest, carefully documenting every absurdity about the diner and getting to know my coworkers better. The next time I stepped in that diner, I was armed not just with memories, but intent and vengeance. It was no longer about the shift, it had morphed into a catalyst to take down a toxic work environment once and for all. As the weeks passed, I slowly began gathering support, showing my colleagues the truth behind Karen's facade, and it wasn't long before the memes and whispers flipped on her. The tides turned swiftly, she was out of the restaurant and back to being the messy bitter person she had always been, while I finally reclaimed my time with my mom. I may have felt guilt at first for refusing to give in, but sometimes putting yourself first is the only way to stop a bigger issue. It was the hardest battle I had gone through yet, but I emerged victorious, with lessons learned, with scars that whispered reminders that no matter how vitriolic the world becomes, integrity always matters more. After all, being a team player doesn't mean losing yourself in someone else's game. I am writing this because if I don't, the memory will consume me. I'm a 28-year-old woman, and for almost half my life, I've harbored a secret that has haunted me since childhood, a secret that recently spilled out and shattered my younger brother's perception of his most cherished memory. 14 years ago, we spent an idyllic summer at our family's lake cabin, where the highlight was a photo of my 6-year-old brother, Daniel, catching his first fish. In that moment, he beamed with an ear-to-ear grin, the sun reflecting off the lake's surface, framing him in what seemed like pure magic. But the truth? That photo was a lie. I'd photoshopped the image to replace a snapshot of him in tears, furious at not being able to haul in the fish I'd caught earlier. I did it to preserve not just his childhood pride but my own. I wanted to be the perfect big sister, the one who always made things better. For years, I let him believe he was a fishing prodigy, a glorious little angler destined for greatness, and I felt like I was doing right by him. However, guilt festered in me, a festering wound pretending to be a scar, and as life would have it, I plotted my confession, trying to plan it in the least destructive way. Yet, the worst time came a few nights ago when Daniel, now a confident 20-year-old with dreams of being a marine biologist, wanted to use that photograph for a presentation on childhood memories. That's when the truth slipped from my mouth like a dark shadow breaking free, the realization that my brother's most treasured moment was nothing more than a fabrication. I watched the joy in his eyes fade until they were eclipsed by confusion and betrayal. I initially thought admitting it meant I'd cleanse my conscience, but it only unleashed a raging storm in him, a tempest of hurt and anger that left him reeling. I thought he'd laugh it off, surely he wouldn't hold it against me. But as I witnessed disbelief morphing slowly into hurt, it dawned on me that I had stripped him of a part of his innocence, weaponized what was supposed to be a simple memory, turning it into a cruel joke that twisted his childhood in ways I never anticipated. "Why would you do that?" he demanded, his voice barely cracking but laced with a boiling fury that felt alien yet terrifyingly real. "It was my moment. You took that from me, and for what? A stupid story?" The pain in his voice cut deeper than any blade, and I crumbled. I never expected to feel this insignificance take root in me, as if I had turned back time and was faced with an immense weight of responsibility. I tried to explain my motives, how I thought I was protecting him, yet my words felt hollow against the backdrop of his devastated expression. That night, he walked out, leaving me alone in that cabin, its walls suddenly closing in on me, each of our shared memories mocking me with their cheerful nostalgia while I was engulfed in darkness. I spent the following hours replays in my mind. What if I'd told him earlier? What if I'd let him have those painful moments? I kept him safe, but I kept him small, shrunk him into this tiny box of falsehoods, and now he wouldn't speak to me. I tossed and turned until dawn, visions of my brother's face swirling, the hurt, confusion, and disgust straining and pulling within me. As I watched the first light of morning creep through the curtains, I made a decision. I needed to do more than just apologize. I needed to show him the truth behind the photo, the real memories, the harshness of life that accompanied growing up. That's when I turned to the internet, diving into every forum, every advice column I could find on how to mend the rifts in family dynamics, how to deal with guilt when it's intertwined with love. It was then that I stumbled onto something strange, a post titled "Twisted Memories, What Would You Do?" The comments flooded my vision, ranging from empathy to outright hostility. It was as if the world had taken their collective traumas and laid them bare for the sake of my enlightenment. Each tale was unique yet framed by a common theme, the struggle of truth versus illusion. Among them, a single comment stood out, a user claiming to have once erased a sibling's memory too. She wrote of a photograph that had twisted a sibling's childhood with dark magic. At first, it seemed absurd, but the more I read, the more I felt a chill creeping down my spine. The user shared that after years of sharing fabricated stories, the guilt manifested as something more sinister. She claimed that reality had warped around her lie, that she began to see glimpses of future memories that became nightmares, shadows that crawled into existence, feeding off the deception. As I read the comment, my heart started to race. I didn't want to spiral, but how could I ignore the uncanny parallels to my life? I decided that if Daniel wouldn't come back to me, I needed to find my own path through the chaos of guilt. I returned to the cabin, armed with the intent to face this truth head-on, and there I felt the weight of those walls close in on me once again, my own memories whispering doubts and fears. I pulled out my phone, wanting to salvage what remained of our bond, and scrolled through old pictures, each swipe sending jolts of nostalgia through me, reminding me of the little boy who had looked up to me for everything. When I stumbled upon the photo in question, there it was, the fake image that haunts me now, the one that ripped away Daniel's childhood dream like a thief in the night. But instead of just darkness, a flicker of something else caught my attention. In one corner of the picture, hidden in the shadows, a figure stood barely visible, unusually distorted, as if it were a reflection of something highly malevolent, its fingers stretched, reaching toward Daniel, the fish eerily vibrant yet dead in his innocent grasp. My heart raced. The comment I had dismissed now felt like a warning. I was about to delete the image, when the memory of that summer clamped down harder than ever. The shadows of our childhood somehow now felt as if they'd been alive all along. The fish, once a token of triumph, now felt like a whisper of something sinister, a memory turned into a potential nightmare, a cycle I had started. Suddenly, the cabin ambience shifted, it felt oppressive, and the air thickened with unshakable dread as I glanced towards the window where a chill breeze swept through, chilling the hair on my arms. There, lurking in the shadows where I'd once seen joy, I perceived movement, just a flicker, but enough to send a cold tremor up my spine. I raced outside, desperate to make sense of what I cropped out all those years ago, hoping to recover the essence of that moment and shield my brother from the darkness that might have crept within our lives through my deceit. What if, in the echoes of my defense, I had unleashed something more sinister, something festering all those years, waiting for the right moment to strike? I took a deep breath as I faced the lake, where sunlight danced innocently across the surface, but the memory of that photo lingered like a stain. I vowed to Daniel that I would rectify this mistake. It wouldn't matter how awful the truth was, it needed to be told. As I plunged into the water, each stroke burned with purpose, with the resolve to collect remnants of the past, to confront whatever shadows had twisted our truth. It took 2 agonizing hours, the sun slipping down the horizon by the time I emerged victorious. I held a rusted fishing lure in my grasp, the very one I recalled tossing in frustration during that summer. As everything fell into place in my mind, I felt a chill run through me, not at the lure but at how dark and twisted my path had become. When I finally returned to shore, I felt different, lighter, yet the shadows lingered, as if darkness intertwined with my essence. As I faced the cabin, knowing I had to confront Daniel, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The shadows seemed to stir, almost mocking me. But I made my way back to the cabin, with each step weighted by that rusty lure, hoping with every part of me to reconcile this burden of childhood illusions before it engulfed us both. And there I found him on the porch, lost in thought, vulnerable, shattered, and staring aimlessly at the fading light. "Daniel," I started, but the tremble in my voice echoed doubts that swirled in the still air. Would my truth be enough? Would it even matter? I hugged the lure to my chest, and as darkness fell around us, I took another step, knowing I still had my own damning shadows to face, a tale woven together by our secrets. I should probably start by mentioning that my mom had always been a force of nature, a woman whose opinions could make or break the day. I used to look up to her, wanting to wear the same stylish clothes and have the same kind of confidence she exuded, but that changed after last year's family gathering when she casually mentioned I had gained weight over the winter. It wasn't said in a cruel way, but rather in her blunt, unyielding tone that left me reeling. At first, I thought about shrugging it off. After all, taste buds can drive the unwary to indulgence, but as weeks passed, I found myself trapping echoes of her words in the corners of my mind. Fast forward a few months later, we were preparing for my sister's wedding, a grand event that would showcase every family member and friend dressed to the nines. When my mom and I went dress shopping, I could feel anticipation buzzing in my veins, but it was bittersweet. Each dress was lovely, but as the sunlight grazed the mirror, it caught the fickle shadows of self-doubt, and every tug of fabric was accompanied by her scrutinizing gaze. Then came the moment I feared. She picked a stunning red dress and held it out like a trophy, but when I emerged from the dressing room, her reaction was not what I hoped for. Honey, I think something a bit looser would suit you better, she said casually, her thin smile carrying an insidious weight. The words hung over me like a cloud threatening rain, and suddenly, all the mannequins seemed to close in around me, like they were whispering to each other. I felt the heat of shame creep through my cheeks, but something snapped. The soft, timid girl she had raised faded into the background as indignation bloomed. I stood there, heart pounding, and said, "AITA for telling Mom I will buy my own dress after she called me fat?" She blinked as if I had just thrown a glass of cold water in her face, and a shaky silence enveloped us. I turned my back, slipping back into the dressing room, and suddenly the chaos outside felt muffled, almost unreal. I wanted to scream, to cry, but instead, I felt a wave of empowerment wash over me. Why did I care what she thought? I rifled through the cheap dresses on the rack. The gaudy sequins and tearing seams felt welcoming in their imperfection. I tried on a simple emerald green gown that fit me like it was tailored just for me, and when I stepped back into the light, something shifted. The vision of the woman I used to be began to morph into something brand new, something brimming with defiance. I slid into the floor-length skirt, the color wrapping around me like a promise. When I looked in the mirror, the reflection staring back wasn't just a girl burdened by her mother's words, it was a woman ready to make a statement, pursuing her independence, daring to redefine beauty on her own terms, and for the first time in a long while, I gasped with joy. I finally came to realize my worth was not tethered to the fabric my mother handed me, and as I walked back, the emerald dress swaying with each step, I could see the shift in her expression. Her eyes widened, a hint of surprise dancing in the corner of her mouth. "That actually looks lovely," she stammered, and something dark twisted in my gut, mingling anger and reluctant acceptance, as I remembered how her voice pierced through my happiness weeks ago. I shook my head, still feeling the rush of courage from leaving her disapproval behind as I answered, "Thanks, but I've decided I'll get my own dress for the wedding." The silence, thick and uncomfortable, tangled in the air between us as I could feel the tension coil tighter, her eyes flaring momentarily with disbelief before rolling into disappointment. She sighed heavily, as if the weight of disappointment in me bore down, and while I once sought her approval, this rejection tasted different. It felt like freedom. I floated to the store entrance, my heart racing but my mind clearer than it had been in weeks, and when I bought the dress on my own terms, I felt like I was taking a bold step into the future instead of shying away from past shadows. Yet in the days leading up to the wedding, I could feel her gaze lingering, a cold prickling on my back as if she were waiting for the right moment to unleash her disappointment, and I braced myself as those wedding bells chimed. When the day finally came, I felt invincible as I pulled that emerald dress over my body, my reflection glowing with defiance. I triumphed through the crowd, my dad beaming with pride, yet behind me, I could sense my mom's silence. That characteristic sharpness in her smirk was nowhere to be found. As the vows exchanged resonated before us, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere deep down, spite lingered in that corner of her heart. Maybe she thought I'd regret standing up for myself, but as I took in the twinkling lights and the wild laughter around me, I knew I wouldn't take that confidence back for anything. The reception was euphoric until, just before it crescendoed, I caught my mother's eyes across the room. She approached, and the air thickened as tension crackled between us. "You really should have let me help you pick something more flattering," she murmured, a thin smile resting on her face but a storm brewing in her expression. My heart raced, and for a moment, I felt the girl I used to be creeping back, whispering to shrink under her disdain, but I wasn't having it. Channeling everything I felt the moment I decided to reclaim my story, I stated firmly, "No, Mom. This is who I am, and if you can't support me, then maybe I was right to buy my own dress after all." She hesitated, an army of emotions flashing through her eyes, and in that moment, I saw both loss and fear mingling with something close to admiration. As the music filled the room and laughter broke around us, I felt the sharp edges of my insecurities dulling, transforming into an armor I never knew I needed. We could stand in the tension of our differences, or I could embrace the freedom that came with walking away from the need for her approval. I walked away from her then, joining my friends who were twirling joyfully under the fairy lights, a smile bursting anew as I danced beneath the stars, and while I could still feel her distant gaze, it didn't pierce through my newfound strength. It simply faded into the background, a reminder that sometimes, to find yourself, you must sever the chains holding you to hurtful expectations, and in that moment, I wasn't just wearing an emerald dress, I was wearing the knowledge that I was enough, just as I am. I never thought Thanksgiving would be the day everything would unravel, but here we are, just a few days away from the holiday when my brother decided to bring his new girlfriend into the family fold. Now, Logan had always been a bit impulsive, jumping from one relationship to another like a child on a trampoline, but this new girl, Tara, was something else. Our family is tight-knit, built on love and respect, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about her. It started a few weeks ago at a family barbecue. Tara showed up uninvited, slinking into our backyard in a low-cut dress and high heels, her laughter too loud and forced. I remember my wife, Sarah, greeting her with a warm smile, the kind that melts the heart, but Tara, with a dismissive wave, merely rolled her eyes, shooting back a caustic remark about how basic the whole event was. I felt the atmosphere freeze, Sarah's smile faltered, and the warmth of family quickly turned to awkwardness, the kind you feel in the pit of your stomach when someone's just been insulted in a room where everyone should feel safe. Despite the tension, I shrugged it off. Relationships take time, maybe she was just a little too much wine and not enough maturity. But then, the comments kept coming. It was like she had a vendetta against my wife, each word woven into a tapestry of disdain. At the next family gathering, she brought up how funny it was that I had the same job for 5 years, as if my dedication to our family's financial security was laughable, but, of course, Logan, ever the oblivious one, just laughed along. My heart raced as I watched Sarah's face contort with hurt. I approached Logan later and voiced my concerns, but he dismissed me, insisting I was being overprotective. It escalated from there, and I couldn't take it anymore. I made it clear, Tara wasn't welcome at our Thanksgiving dinner. This was a day for family, love, and gratitude, not taunts and jabs at the dinner table. When I broke the news to Logan, he went quiet, his face morphing into disbelief and anger, like I'd slapped him. "You can't just dictate who I can date," he exploded, red-faced and incensed. I stood my ground. "I'm not dictating anything, I'm protecting my family." Our conversation devolved into a fight, complete with accusations of me being controlling and unfair. It spiraled until we were both shouting, and I could see the hurt in his eyes, that I was pushing him away. But then he brought Sarah into it, saying that if she couldn't handle a little teasing, maybe I shouldn't have married her. That hit harder than any insult Tara had thrown, and I felt an icy rage boil inside me. Thanksgiving came, the air crisp and chilly, and I still buzzed with anger. Sarah was tentative around me, unsure of how to ease the tension brewing like a storm above our family eagle's nest, as she called it. I thought about all that Tara had put her through, how she had disrespected the very foundation of our lives together. The day of Thanksgiving dawned bright, but the shadow of the upcoming confrontation loomed large. I spent the day cooking, the sense of turkey and stuffing filling our home, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Logan, wondering if he'd take the high road or wash his hands of our family tradition. Then, the doorbell rang, and I knew who it was before I even looked through the peephole. There he stood, all confident bravado, with Tara clinging to his arm like a leech. I opened the door, plastering on a smile that felt more like a grimace. "Hey, Logan. Happy Thanksgiving," I said, already regretting every bit of small talk that was about to ensue. "Thanks, man, good to see you," he replied, his voice leeching with tension as he glanced at my face for any sign of approval. Tara, however, was a different story. Rather than grace myself with a simple hello, she leaned in close to me and whispered, "You're really upset I'm here, aren't you, sweetie?" In a tone so saccharine it made my teeth ache. I could taste the bile rising in my throat as the words hung thick in the air. I forced a laugh, but inside, I was battling the monster of rage swarming my insides. I ushered them inside and busied myself with the preparations, Sarah already setting the table with an uncharacteristically somber expression. Tara breezed around the house, commenting on the decorations, how they looked cheap, as if she had any room to talk, and I was ready to snap. Dinner came, and we all settled down, tension thick enough to slice with a knife. Small talk morphed into a battlefield, and as Tara consumed her plate, every word dripped with thinly veiled mockery directed at my wife until Sarah excused herself and left the table. I caught a glimpse of her eyes, shimmering with unshed tears, and something inside me snapped. I stood up so hard my chair toppled over. "Tara, if you can't show my wife respect in her own home, you don't deserve to be here and neither does Logan," I spat, all of my pent-up frustration exploding in a mixture of protective love and seething anger. The table fell silent, forks frozen in midair, as Logan shot out of his chair, flaring with indignation. "You're being unreasonable. She's my girlfriend," he screamed, the table shaking under the weight of his fury. But it was Tara that caught me off guard when she leaned back and said, honestly, Your life sounds pathetic. I feel sorry for your wife. My heart dropped like lead, the air became thick with something heavy. Was it hatred or contempt? I took a breath, steadying myself. You're right, Tara, I do feel sorry for you. You've managed to entangle yourself with a man who clearly doesn't see the damage you're doing. Logan looked stricken, staring between us, torn. That was when I reached my breaking point, turning to him and saying, "You deserve better than this, and so does she. I'm not the bad guy here, you are. I'll choose family over a petty squabble with a woman who can't respect my wife." I suddenly felt hollow and exposed, a dark mantle of anger and shame wrapping around me. Logan shook his head in fury, and I saw a ripple of realization cross his face, the anger twisting into a profound confusion. Tara stood there, smugly, as if to say she had just won a twisted game of chess where she expected to claim the crown. That's when I kicked them out, a moment that felt both immensely satisfying and eviscerating at the same time. I slammed the door behind them, breathing heavily, my heart racing faster than it had in years as I faced the fallout. I turned to find Sarah framed in the kitchen doorway, her face a landscape of conflicting emotions, pride, sadness, and relief, all tangled into a sorrowful smile. The room felt different, lighter somehow, as we held each other's gaze, and in that moment, I knew we could withstand anything, while all I could think about was whether I had chosen rightly for my family. Maybe I wasn't in the wrong after all. The evening faded into laughter, warmth, and heads bowed in thanks, filled with new traditions where respect governed the values we all held dear. A thin veil hung over the doorway where resentment no longer dared cross. I wasn't the kind of guy who went around crushing the dreams of 7-year-olds, but something about my girlfriend's brother, Timmy, always rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe it was the way he puffed out his chest as if he were a king while wearing his oversized superhero pajamas, or the fact that he made me play against him in video games every single time I came over because he was convinced he could beat me if I just dared to try. I used to let him win. Sure, I'd play a little harder than normal, but I figured it built his confidence. Timmy was a sweet kid otherwise, always the first to offer me a cookie from his stash or show me his favorite toy, but there was something almost sinister beneath the surface of that small, innocent face. It was his relentless whining every time I beat him, the way he would stomp his foot and demand I go again, claiming I was cheating as if I were some kind of adult monster trying to ruin his childhood. I tried to laugh it off. I didn't want to diminish a kid's spirit, but when he kept taunting me about how I was never going to beat him at anything ever, I felt that familiar itch to prove a point. It was a calm Saturday evening when I finally snapped. My girlfriend was baking cookies in the other room, and the sweet, chocolatey smell wafted through the air, mixing with Timmy's cries of frustration as I scored yet another winning point. "You just let me win, didn't you?" he accused, glaring at me with those huge, innocent brown eyes that suddenly didn't seem so innocent, as if the shadows of the dimly lit room were casting a spell that twisted his features into something darker. I took a deep breath, my heart racing as something primal ignited in me, a sudden desire not just to win, but to utterly destroy his confidence right then and there. "No, Timmy, this time it's for real," I said, feeling a surge of energy course through my veins. I wouldn't just let him win, I would crush him, mercilessly. As we picked up the controllers with renewed intensity, I focused my eyes on the screen, which seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, the colors flashing brighter as I dove deeper into the game. I performed moves I didn't even know I had inside me, deftly dodging every attack and countering every strategy he tried to pull. With each round I won, I expected Timmy to laugh or challenge me more fiercely, but the glow of the TV reflected in his gaze as he stared in stunned silence at the pixels that represented his rapidly fading hope. I felt exhilarated, but as his face fell, I also felt a strange chill creeping up my spine. It was as if the house around us was growing colder, the walls whispering tales of the arrogance of pride and the dark side of competition. "I'm not letting you win again, Timmy. This is just how it is, and you need to understand that." The words tasted bitter on my tongue as I said them, and for a moment, guilt washed over me like a cold wave crashing onto the shore of a lonely beach, but I pushed it aside, and focused on the screen. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, I turned the game into a dominating disaster for him. I perfected the final move, and just as I hit the game's concluding action, the room was engulfed in darkness. The TV flickered and died, plunging us into an eerie silence, the only sound being the added stream of my own heavy breathing, and I felt every ounce of joy drain from the atmosphere as Timmy sat there trembling, his small hands clenched into fists that shook like leaves caught in a violent storm. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice a whisper as though he was terrified of the answer. I started to reply, but that was when I noticed the lights in the house flickering strangely, almost rhythmically, as if trying to communicate in a language only the children of nightmares could understand. The shadows lengthened, extending across the walls like spectral fingers grasping for something they shouldn't have, and in that moment, I realized that the darkness had not merely consumed the television but had troubled the very foundation of our reality. Timmy's laughter turned into a wheeze as he backed away from me, terror dancing in his features, and I don't know what compelled me from that point on, but I instinctively moved toward him, wanting to make him feel safe, wanting him to understand that I was still in control. When my hand brushed against his shoulder, the air turned heavy, the atmosphere thick with something sinister, something that had been lingering in the corners of the room, waiting for just this moment to reveal itself. I thought I heard whispers, distant and haunting, echoing within my mind, and they sounded alarmingly like Timmy's voice as he gasped and said, "I just wanted to win." And I couldn't help but laugh, a short, nervous chuckle that caught deep in my throat, because it suddenly became clear that this was about more than just winning a game. This had become a matter of life and death. Then he ran. Timmy bolted for the door, screaming his lungs out, but the house felt like it closed in around me, the walls twisting and folding until I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making. Shadows crawled along the floor like spiders, wrapping their clammy fingers around my ankles as I stumbled forward, trying to follow him, but it was as if the house didn't want me to leave. Then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped, the lights flickered back on, illuminating the room in a blinding flash, and there stood Timmy, wide-eyed, as if he had just caught a glimpse of something unspeakably horrifying. Blood drained from my face as dread settled in my stomach. Whatever demon had stirred inside that game was now writhing between us, an unspoken accusation hanging in the air. Are you mad?" He stammered as fear carved lines into his innocent face, and just when I thought I'd backed myself into a corner from which I could never escape, I heard it, an echo of laughter, warped and malevolent, that seemed to seep from the very walls, shaking them with sinister intent. That's when I knew, I had irrevocably broken something inside Timmy, something precious and innocent, and whatever darkness had awakened in that moment was now straining to escape. In that split second, I realized that I wasn't just facing the consequences of my cruel decision, I had unleashed something terrifying, a cruel shadow cast by my own hubris. A cold shiver snaked its way down my spine, as I whispered to Timmy, "I didn't mean for this to happen," but the words felt hollow and the room echoed back with an unsettling refrain, timid yet filled with a knowing horror. We stared into the face of an inexplicable fear, one that bore no physical form yet demanded to be reckoned with, and as I stood there paralyzed, I could almost feel the world fracturing beneath my feet. Those few seconds stretched long and thin, moments filled with understanding that some lines should never be crossed. I knew I needed to do something, to make amends while I could still grasp reality, but just then, Timmy's laughter resumed, only this time it sounded like the crackling of dry leaves underfoot, a boy's giggle turned cruel, echoing from the shadows that had seeped into the corners of the room. I was caught in a web of my own making, shackled by consequences, trapped in a darkness that bore witness to my mistakes, and I was left wondering if I had indeed become the monster in the children's tale I'd once considered so innocent, the very arbiter of nightmares unleashed upon this world in an unthinking act of pride. I never thought that a simple no could spiral my life into a relentless nightmare, but then again, I think we often underestimate how quickly the human mind can twist itself into the shape of malice. It all started when my neighbor, who I had always considered friendly, knocked on my door one chilly autumn afternoon. He was desperate, explaining that he had family visiting and no parking space available, pleading for just one day's use of my extra spot, something I had meticulously preserved since my brother had passed. I felt guilty, even as I formed my words, recalling that it wasn't my responsibility to accommodate him. "I'm sorry, but I really need that spot," I said firmly. He blinked, disappointment flashing across his face, and for a split second, I worried I had crossed some invisible line. "Okay, suit yourself," he replied, his voice slipping into that unsettling calmness that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. That evening, I settled into my usual routine, but the air in my apartment felt thick and stifling, as if the walls themselves were eavesdropping. The next day, I noticed my neighbor's car parked in front of my driveway, blocking my entrance. It wasn't the first time this had happened, but now it felt like a direct challenge. I stepped outside, greeted by a swollen sense of dread. "Could you move your car?" I called out, forcing a smile that felt feeble. His response sent chills racing along my spine. "Not my fault your spot is empty, is it?" From then on, it felt like a war, each day adding fuel to the fires of resentment. He called in false complaints about my late-night music. Neighborhood Watch was informed that I had too many guests parked out front, and it wasn't long before I realized he made it clear to others that I was a nightmare neighbor. The whispers slithered through the streets like an unwelcome fog, suffocating every connection I'd formed in the block. Isolation wrapped around me, a warm but suffocating blanket. I went to my car one moonlit evening only to find it scratched, deep gashes carved across the pristine paint. I stood there, heart racing, and it hit me that this was no coincidence. When I confronted him, he merely laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that haunted me even in my dreams. It wasn't long before every friendly face in the neighborhood turned away, lost somewhere in the disarray of rumors and twisted truths. I decided to take a different route and began documenting everything, each incident meticulously noted in a notebook, the complaints, the damage, the ominous notes slipped under my door. It felt sensible at first, like a lifeline thrown into a pool of chaos, but as the pages turned, the act felt increasingly paranoid and desperate. One night, racked with anxiety, I curled up on my couch with a few glasses of wine, hoping the alcohol would dull the sharp edges of fear. While grappling with insomnia, I decided to check my doorbell camera, both for shreds of sanity and evidence. I just wanted to run through the footage of the night I had scratched paint. To my horror, I discovered something I could never have anticipated, my neighbor standing outside, wearing a thick black hoodie, his face obscured beneath the darkness of a winter night. He loomed by my car, pouring some clear liquid onto the trunk. It shimmered like a bright star when it caught the light. I panicked, realizing I had forgotten to lock my door. Shoving past the beers and the remnants of junk food, defense mechanisms against the chilling apprehension now boiling my blood, I ran to the door, my heart pounding a thunderous rhythm. I flung it open, but he was gone, leaving behind an echo of laughter that felt like ice spilling through my veins. The next day, I filed a police report, but the officer, a weary middle-aged man with coffee stains on his uniform, seemed more amused than concerned. "Just a neighbor dispute, ma'am, nothing serious," he chuckled, dismissing my escalating paranoia while I insisted through gritted teeth that his actions had crossed an unsafe line. Days turned into weeks, but the situation escalated. One morning, I woke to find my entire car was covered in eggs, some smashed and gunky, the others still intact like rotten grenades. I could no longer discern the difference between reality and a waking nightmare. Was it even possible for someone to be that vindictive? A dark reflection of my own thoughts bubbled up, suggesting maybe this monsoon of chaos wouldn't end until I retaliated, until I dove as deep into this nightmarish rabbit hole as he had. But just as I found a tiny ember of resolve within, unease cloaked me as I spied him staring at me one lonely afternoon, a wide grin plastered across his face. It twisted something inside me. Perhaps this was all a game to him. I sought answers, diving into deeper roots. I tracked whispers of past neighbors who had endured their own terror at his hands, piecing together a fractured narrative that revealed a history soaked in acrimony. Each encounter morphed into dread, the shadows thickening with lies. The sense of friendship had crystallized into something sinister. My final attempt to reclaim my space felt extravagant, even foolish. I tossed out everything I had documented and staged a confrontation I knew bordered on insanity. The night felt thick with foreboding as I cornered him outside, demanding he leave me alone, but he merely laughed again, that infuriating, deep sound that wrapped around my consciousness like a vice. "Why don't you focus on managing your own space instead of wasting time at my door?" His words rolled over me like a cold wave. In that moment, I recognized the absurdity of trying to fight someone so twisted, so bent. I stepped back, something inside me fracturing as I muttered, "You'll regret this," my voice small, an echo of fading confidence. And just as I turned to leave, I heard what felt like the closing act of a narrative gone awry, my heart halting when he called out to me one last time, "You already have." I drove that evening, not to work or friends, but to the edge of sanity, piecing together the tangled web of fear and loathing that had bared itself in my life. It took time, but in those shockingly still moments, clarity descended upon me. I understood my only option to end this sick game was to move away permanently, to cleanse myself of the taint of his shadowy presence. As I packed, every belonging stripped away from the condo felt like an entanglement burnt from me. I left that apartment a shell of who I was, yet had it ever truly been mine? I shrugged off the weight of his existence like a snake distilling its skin. But as I drove toward the next chapter in my life, with a bittersweet taste, I vowed to never forget the lesson learned. In neighborhoods where darkness breeds, kindness is a fickle facade, and sometimes refusing to let others in comes with a heavy price. Last summer, I moved into a small neighborhood where everyone seemed friendly at first, but things took a bizarre turn after I had a confrontation with my neighbor, Mr. Thompson. It all started when I casually mentioned to him, while he was washing his yard gnomes, how I preferred parking in my designated spot because it was the only small power I had in the chaos of moving into a new place. He chuckled, waving his sponge like a wand, and assured me he understood my plight. But weeks later, I got the unmistakable vibe that he didn't. Each night after work, I'd come home to find his dented old pickup parked in my spot, encroaching on my territory like a predator marking its territory. Feeling bold one evening, I knocked on his door, my heart thumping violently, and explained my frustration. He grinned wider than any normal person could, his smile stretching across his face until it felt like it threatened to split him open. "It's just a spot," he said, a hint of something darker threading through his placid demeanor, like oil slicking through water. I had to sleep on it before responding because it unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. The following week, I returned home to find his truck occupying my space yet again, and with it, I felt a surge of familiar dread, though I couldn't quite place why. That night, a heavy storm washed over the neighborhood, accompanied by howling winds that rattled windows and sent branches skittering across the pavement. In the middle of my insomnia-fueled anxiety, I thought I heard someone tapping at my window. Peeking through the blinds, I was shocked to see Mr. Thompson standing there, drenched, his face smeared with rain and shadows, that same smile plastered on, more disturbing than ever. He called my name in this playful sing-song voice, but I swear, behind his eyes was something twisted, as if a different creature was behind them. Terrified, I yanked away from the window, hoping he'd disappear, praying for the dawn to come and that everything would just make sense again. The next morning, filled with anxiety-induced bravado, I marched back to his house to confront him fully. His wife, a ghostly figure I rarely saw, answered, her eyes glazed over as if she was looking through the world. I asked her if Mr. Thompson had come home last night, and she blinked at me, slowly, then in a flat voice said he was out working late at the greenhouse. I didn't even know he had one. Confused and feeling a sense of foreboding, I repeated the words in my head like a mantra as I took note of the strange plant-shaped shadows lurking at the edge of his yard. Days passed, and each evening he blocked my parking spot again until I snapped. I marched over, my blood hot and my hands trembling, and confronted him in front of his wife, who just stood there, slack-jawed. "You need to stop parking in my space," I shouted, the sunlight flickering through the leaves casting an eerie glow on us, and for once, Mr. Thompson's smile faded, replaced by a cold, hard glare that cut deep as if he weighed the consequence of my existence. He leaned closer, the air around him growing thick, and that's when I noticed how strange he smelled, like fresh soil and something rotten, before muttering something I couldn't comprehend, words that slithered into an unnatural hiss. I backed away slowly, hurriedly retreating home, but the very next day, I found my car's tires slashed, neatly done with the precision of a surgeon. Fear crept through me as I watched that cursed pickup parked yet again in my designated spot later that night. Deciding I couldn't take it anymore, I filed a complaint with the HOA, but nothing came of it. Apparently, they were quite fond of Mr. Thompson and had no reason to believe my story. In an act of desperate folly, I turned to social media and connected with a local group about neighborhood issues, sharing my strange, escalating situation. Surprisingly, others chimed in with their strange experiences of him. People spoke of unsettling artworks made of nature's remnants that he gifted them, of their pets going missing. The fear blossomed into something all-consuming, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that Mr. Thompson was somehow connected to the missing pets, perhaps a sacrifice to the odd, twisted plants that apparently thrived in his mysterious greenhouse. Then, on a particularly tense night, I heard rustling outside my house, followed by soft whispering. Peering outside, my stomach dropped. There he was, Mr. Thompson, standing among the shadows with some others, figures I didn't recognize, as they circled something low to the ground. The dim light caught the glimmer of a long, slender object that glistened like a knife. Before I could catch my breath, they turned in unison, their expressions becoming warped, contorted mixtures of glee and malevolence, eyes shining like bleached bone, and I stumbled backward, panic spiking, the dark veil of night swallowing me whole. I resolved to end this once and for all. I waited until the next evening, finally gathering enough courage to sneak into his backyard. I needed proof. Just as I ducked beneath the overgrown vines, there it was, the greenhouse, more like a mausoleum, shrouded in darkness, where the air felt heavy with secrets. Peering through the glass, I could barely breathe. What I saw would haunt me forever. Inside lay not just plants but fragments of what looked unmistakably like the missing pets, their fur woven intricately amidst the foliage in a reverent show of grotesque artistry. Bottles of dark liquid lined the shelves, and I realized I had stumbled upon something far worse than mere vengeance over a parking spot. They had turned into something sinister, a cult dedicated to reclaiming life through bizarre rituals, and suddenly, my car didn't seem like an innocent dispute anymore. It was an offering of insidious attention. I slipped back home, heart pounding in rhythm to my blind terror, attempting to rationalize what I'd seen but knowing deep down there was a price to pay. Despite my fears, I couldn't let him continue getting away with it. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I had inadvertently become the centerpiece of their twisted offering, the outsider whose boundaries they would not respect. I dug deeper into local lore and found a chilling story of disappearances linked to a green thumb that preyed on the naive and unsuspecting, a sordid tale of nature reclaiming itself through blood and bone. By the end of that cursed week, I was determined to leave, sneaking out under the cover of dawn, but when I got to my car, I saw at least 5 gnarled, vine-like tendrils creeping from beneath, wrapping around my tires and digging into the earth-like roots. Looking up, I froze in place. There was Mr. Thompson, inches away, that same smile stretched across his face, wild approval dancing in his eyes. "It's just a spot," he whispered, voice smooth and filled with eager resonance. In that moment, I understood what I'd become, just another lost soul to nourish his insatiable craving for dominance over life, held captive with the realization that the only way to escape this otherworldly nightmare would be to surrender my life as a tribute, the very sacrifice that would grant him what he sought. And as he leaned closer, inviting me deeper into the darkness, I screamed internally, realizing I was trapped in a game with no escape, with no answers. AITA for asking him not to park in my spot? It turns out that in this twisted web of existence, sometimes the rules aren't just for parking spaces, they're about survival. Growing up, I always knew I was different from the other kids in my town. While most families seemed whole and uncomplicated, my reality was a patchwork quilt of half-truths and familial tensions, my parents' marriage a fragile thing that shattered when I was just 15. It was then that my mom revealed to me the existence of my half-sister, Lily, a product of my dad's affair, and though I initially felt a strange sort of sympathy for her, that empathy twisted and hardened as years went by. With my mother constantly torn between her loyalty to our bloodline and the shame her husband's infidelity brought upon us, she began to favor Lily, at least in the subtler, unmeasured ways, an extra scoop of ice cream at parties, bonus minutes spent in delighted conversation that I never seemed to earn. It came to a head when my mother decided to gift Lily our family's most prized heirloom, a delicate silver necklace adorned with a single emerald, which had belonged to my grandmother and was said to carry the blessings of strength and resilience. That summer evening, as I stood there aghast, Lily grinning in delighted astonishment while my heart pounded like a war drum echoing betrayal through my veins, I felt my chest constrict with such a mix of emotions, rage, contempt, and something jaggedly sharp that I'd only admit to myself years later, a deep, gnawing sense of loss. I told her she didn't deserve it, the words spilling out of my mouth like venom, and for a moment the air was thick with a silence that amplified the quiet sobs my mother stifled. In an instant, Lily's joy was crushed under the weight of my accusation, her face paling. "You don't even know me," she retorted, but the words cut deeper than any knife, and for a fleeting moment, I saw irritation fuse with sadness in her eyes. Everything spiraled after that. My mom refused to talk to me, her disappointment a tangible cloud that enveloped our home, wrapping itself so tightly around me that I suffocated in shame. I convinced myself I was right, that I was standing up for the sanctity of our family line, not to mention my grandmother's memory, but every day that dragged into weeks left a bitter residue on my soul, and Lily was the ghost haunting me wherever I went until one nameless, starlit night I found myself on my way to meet her, a stupid impulse driving me forward like a moth to a flame, thinking maybe, just maybe, I could mend the frayed edges of the relationship I sabotaged so recklessly. Lily lived in an old Victorian that smelled of mildew and neglect, her laughter once light-hearted now tinged with a hardness that spoke of years spent being a shadow, always outshined by a bone-deep allure of a necklace she knew would never belong to her. She opened the door with hesitation, and I noticed the way her eyes flickered with a cocktail of surprise and cautious hope. "What do you want?" she asked, but the sharpness of her tone melted the moment she caught sight of the little box I held closely, the very one my mother had used to gift her that damned necklace. Sorry, I stuttered, feeling the weight of my words evaporate in the cool night air. I wanted you to have it, because it's not the necklace that matters, it's what it represents, the love and connection that comes with it. Yet as I held out the small box, Lily's expression shifted, confusion wrinkles furrowing her brow. You're just saying that because of Mom, she whispered, bitterness flowing through every syllable, making me realize how wrong I was to believe that a simple apology would eclipse the years of resentment we shared. But then, she surprised me, her eyes softening as she slowly reached for the box, delicate fingers trembling, and I felt a warm swell in my chest. For a moment, we exchanged something sacred, a flicker of that sisterly bond that had been buried in the rubble of our complicated heritage. But in the back of my mind, a plaguing thought lingered. What if the real ghost that was haunting me wasn't the fractured family ties but rather what lay inside that necklace box? As the night unfolded, and shadows danced across her living room, something broke in me when I finally said, "It's cursed." Lily laughed, a sound that echoed against the walls, disbelief sparkling in her eyes, but I persisted, recounting the whispers I'd heard, the warnings passed down through years, that the necklace held a dark secret. My grandmother had insisted on wearing it every single day until her last breath, her slow decline a shadowed testimony to its malevolence. That revelation hung in the air like a lightning storm, and I hoped the curse would shatter the moment, expose any fragile connection we had. But when Lily pulled the necklace from its velvet resting place, I swear I felt the temperature drop as darkness unfurled around us, an unsettling whisper brushing through the air, weaving itself through the tension. "You think I can't handle it?" she challenged, heart blazing with defiance, and my stomach dropped as I caught her twisting the delicate chain around her neck, the emerald glimmering ominously at the hollow of her throat. The lights flickered, shadows growing long and distorted, stretching across the room, and I felt as if I was standing at the edge of a precipice as dread unfurled like a storm. I approached her cautiously, my heart racing, assuring her it was just an old wives' tale, but the moment she pressed her fingertips against the cool emerald, my voice was drowned out by a rumble, the ground beneath us trembling. Suddenly, with a crash, the windows shattered violently, a gust of icy wind rushing in, a fury unleashed. I screamed for her to take it off, but she stood there, frozen, eyes wide with a mix of terror and exhilaration, a new kind of laughter spilling from her lips that sent chills down my spine. In that instant, I knew we were no longer searching for forgiveness, nor sisterhood, but rather that darkness was claiming her, just as it had claimed our grandmother. The necklace now tangled around her like a malevolent snake, it began to glow with an ethereal light, and as the horrifying truth dawned on me, I realized I didn't just destroy our family's legacy, I unleashed a haunting that neither of us could escape. It was too late for apologies now. With a heartbreaking resolve, I rushed towards her, desperate to rip it away, but unearthly sounds erupted from the shadows, screeching and wailing, a cacophony promising suffering, promising that we had both become part of something far beyond our understanding. The necklace glowed brighter, swallowing her whole as Lily screamed, an echo of anger, fear, and, above all, despair, before she simply vanished, the necklace spiraling into darkness as my heart shattered. I stumbled back, gasping, the world around me disassembling into chaos as I realized, the truth was never about deserving the necklace, it was about the curse that tethered us both to the ghosts of our past, and in my heart, I knew I would forever carry the weight of what happened that night, a sister still lost to the shadows, the necklace a constant reminder that in this twisted story, no one was truly innocent and I was left haunted by the question, AITA for telling my half-sister she didn't deserve my mom's necklace? AITA for using the word consent against my mother? I never thought I'd find myself typing this on a late Tuesday night, but here I am, heart racing, fingers trembling on the keyboard, desperate for some semblance of understanding about what just transpired in my life. It all started when I decided to visit my parents for the weekend. I hadn't been home in months, and I could sense my mom's disdain through the intermittent phone calls I received, filled with thinly veiled remarks about how I'd just forgotten about them. So, with a mix of guilt and nostalgia, I packed my bags and drove the 2 hours back to the house I grew up in, the place that held a billion memories, both good and bad. As I pulled into the driveway, a chill ran down my spine, but I shrugged it off as anxiety. After all, who really wants to discuss their life choices over dinner? My mom greeted me with her usual overbearing affection, hugging me tightly, her perfume cloying yet familiar, and I felt the knot of tension in my stomach slowly start to unravel. We chatted over dinner, the conversation light and predictable, until the topic shifted to my love life, a subject my mother tends to tackle using a hammer instead of a scalpel. She pressed me, asked questions I didn't want to answer, and her probing took on a sharp edge that I eventually pushed back against. That's when I uttered the word consent. It slipped out during an argument after she told me to pick better partners. I just couldn't take her lecture anymore. I said something like, "Mom, it's my life. I get to choose who I want to be with, and I need your consent to make me feel worthy." It wasn't meant to hurt her, but the air changed in an instant. Her face darkened, a look I had never seen before, as if I had slammed a door in her face, a door I didn't even know existed until that moment. Silence stretched like a rubber band ready to snap, and I could feel my heart thudding in my chest. My mother's eyes shimmered with a complex blend of hurt and rage, and she took a step back, her breath hitching as if someone had stolen the air from her lungs. I couldn't comprehend what had happened. All I knew was that I had crossed a line that I hadn't even known was there. It was a conversation spiraling completely out of control, and before I could backtrack or even apologize, she screamed. "You think you can use that word against me? You think I don't know what consent means? I didn't give birth to you just for you to throw it back in my face." I was taken aback, utterly stunned. Her face had grown pale, her features tightly coiled like a snake preparing to strike. In that moment, I felt a mix of anger and defiance as I shot back, "I'm just saying that consent goes both ways, Mom. You can't control my life, and this guilt trip is not what healthy parenting looks like." The tension suffocated the room, and that storm-clouded silence fell over us again, thick with resentment and suppressed emotions. I half expected her to storm out, to slam a door, but she stood there, trembling, looking like a portrait of shattered pride. It became painfully clear that this had triggered something deeper, something hidden beneath layers of our past. So I did what I thought was right, hoping to take the narrative back into my hands. I reached out, trying to connect, desperate to clear the air. "Mom, I didn't mean it like that," I pleaded, but my words were met with a blank stare, and suddenly she whispered a name that sent a shockwave through my body, my grandmother's. She used to say consent is why I had to fight for you, why I had to endure pain, so you could be free. Those words felt like ice piercing through my veins. It was like she had opened a door I never knew existed. My grandmother had always been a mysterious figure, a woman who had endured much and left behind stories that were always shrouded in whispers. I searched my mother's face for any hint of explanation, but instead, she crumbled into tears and I watched, horrified, as years of unspoken grievances poured out. She started to tell me about her childhood, how my grandmother had made choices that had shackled her to an unhappy marriage and a life of regret, all born from a warped sense of broken consent she could never escape, and I sat there, frozen, overwhelmed by sadness for a past I couldn't touch. "I was supposed to be your protector," she sobbed, "but it all feels so twisted. I never wanted you to feel the same pain I did." In an instant, I realized the true weight of what I had said. Our entire lives were entangled in these invisible threads, stretching across generations. It wasn't just about our conversation anymore, it was history echoing through the walls of our family home. It became clear that the word consent had opened a Pandora's box of unhealed wounds and buried sorrows. I thought I was just standing up for myself, but instead, I was confronting a legacy of pain I never fully understood. I held her tightly, both of us enveloped in tears, and for the first time, we acknowledged the silent cries of our past. But even within that embrace, a part of me knew that this revelation wouldn't be the end. It was just the beginning of a much longer journey we would have to navigate together, facing truths that could rip families apart or, maybe, for the first time, bring us closer. So, now I sit here questioning myself, wondering, AITA? Part of me feels guilt for awakening this dark past in my mother, another part knows if I hadn't said anything, we may have remained stuck in our silence. Maybe, in breaking the chain, I was finally breaking free. It was a rainy Saturday morning, and the small coffee shop on the corner was packed, mirroring the storm outside with its chaotic energy. I managed to snag the last table, a tiny two-seater with a view of the dripping city streets, just as the door swung open to let in a gust of wind and a figure I would soon come to regret. She stumbled in, a wild-haired woman in a tattered raincoat, her face obscured by a tangle of frizzy curls, and for an instant, everything around me fell silent. She hovered in the doorway like some tragic specter. I caught a whiff of her as she approached the counter to order, and it hit me like a brick wall: sweat, rot and something I couldn't quite place, a medley of unkempt days stacked one atop the other like trash piling up in a back alley. I instinctively retracted my shoulders, suddenly hyper-aware of the people left standing in the queue, but they all wore expressions of discomfort, mirroring my own. Every instinct told me to maintain my distance. Her essence intruded upon the coffee shop's warm, cinnamon-tinged ambience. I was already watching people navigate between the tables, searching for a place to sit, and as I sipped cautiously on my overly sweet vanilla latte, I hoped she would find a corner where her smell wouldn't reach me. But life is never that simple. She approached my table, draped her coat over the back of the chair opposite me, and smiled a toothy grin that felt more like a warning than anything else. "Is this seat taken?" she chirped, and the pit in my stomach deepened as the aroma clung to the air around us, a thick, suffocating blanket that made my brain scream for escape. I wanted to be polite, to tell her I was waiting for someone, but the words caught in my throat, twisted by the harsh reality of her scent clinging to every surface. Instead, I cleared my throat, forcing a strained smile. "Actually, I'm just waiting for a friend," I replied, emphasizing the word friend like it was a sacred charm. She blinked and leaned in closer, the stench intensifying as if she had inhaled all the miseries of the world and exhaled them right in my direction. "Oh, come on, there's no need for that," she said, her voice a strange mix of persistence and desperation that instantly spat in the face of my discomfort. "It's a crowded place, just a quick sit until they find a seat." I felt my throat tighten further. I wanted to rise like a ghost, but the warmth of the latte paled in comparison to the cold, invading anxiety clawing at my chest. I could feel the eyes around us narrow in scrutiny, silently judging me, and I knew that I had to stand my ground because the alternative was unthinkable. I shook my head slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. "I'm sorry, but I really can't. I need some space." The silence that followed felt heavy, as if the whole cafe held its breath, waiting for her reaction. Her expression shifted from surprise to something darker, a flicker of indignation igniting beneath the surface of her frazzled exterior. "You're really going to turn me away? Just because of how I smell?" she hissed, her voice dropping low yet piercing, echoing between tables, punctuated by the clinking of mugs and muted chatter that seemed to suddenly fade into mere background noise. My chest tightened, caught between a wave of guilt and the suffocating dread of being captured by her discomfort. I wanted to scream to the world that I wasn't the bad guy here, that this wasn't about her as a person, that my senses were fighting a losing battle against her reality. But it was too late. In her narrowed eyes, I saw the slow dawning realization that I might be one of the few people refusing to let her presence invade their space. She sat back, huffing, shoulders slumping, tail between her legs. I could tell she felt it, the weight of her own isolation, the lack of kindness in an unfriendly world, but I was drowning, gasping for clean air. That's when she leaned forward again, eyes alight with something indefinable, an unsettling spark swirling behind them. "You know, there's a name for people like you. They call you made of money and you turn your back on someone who just needs to rest. You won't remember this moment, you'll move on with your perfect, clean life while I'm left here in the dirt you won't even acknowledge." I braced myself for a possible outburst, but every moment of tension bent its spine back upon itself, wrapping the room in an atmosphere thick with anticipation. I wanted to hurl my guilt at her, to explain that I didn't have a perfect life, I had bills that made me sweat in my sleep and deadlines that haunted me. But her words cut deeper, and I found myself staring down into my latte, the froth swirling like crowded thoughts in my mind as shame crept over me like a thief in the night. "I'm not the bad guy here," I attempted to insist, voice trembling with uncertainty and helplessness, but I was drowning in her eyes, the raw emotion behind them flaying the fabric of my justification. Then, slowly, she straightened, mouth a thin line, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. Instead, she threw her head back and laughed. It wasn't the laughter of someone who found joy, it was the brittle kind that echoed of deep wounds and ancient hurts that made me wonder how often had she been ridiculed in this very way. Anger flared briefly at the edge of my thoughts, casting shadows of self-doubt into the void. Was I really the monster I'd been painted to be? The onlookers shifted in discomfort. It appeared to be a performance now, a spectator's sport of empathy versus survival. The barista even paused as she made cappuccinos, casting sideways glances at us as the mayhem unfolded. I wish I could have shrunk down into the woven fabric of the chair, to escape the twisted narrative taking form. "You know what," she said finally, a dangerous confidence threading her voice, "you might think you're better than me now, but if you saw what I saw, if you felt what I feel, you'd run screaming into the night." My stomach churned as her words slithered into my mind, sharp and sinuous, and I did not want to imagine. We were worlds apart, yet standing in the same coffee shop, and I wasn't proud of the thoughts rolling through my head, thoughts that toyed with my sanity, testing the limits of my own humanity. I could hear my heart pounding within the petrified silence, the air thick as if the rain outside had seeped into our souls. Every interaction matters, she hissed, leaning closer still, unyielding. I held my breath, feeling myself unravel, wishing for the comfort of ignorance, and just when I thought it couldn't get worse, she added, "You think you understand what hell smells like, don't you?" The way she said it settled into my mind, twisting something deep inside me that tasted like regret and fear. I suddenly feared she could see through my facade, peel back my parameters and expose all that lay in ruin beneath. I was just about to protest, to shove her back into the abyss she claimed to know so intimately when, without a moment's warning, her left hand moved with precision to her coat pocket. Instinctually, I shrank back, my heart racing, wondering what she could possibly produce from that tangle of fabric. But then a glint caught the light, and in the size of an instant, I realized it was a small brass key, the kind you might find in an old hotel room. "You know, ever since I showed up, you have been hating this moment," she whispered fiercely. "But I could set you free, you know? I keep the worst of them at bay, all you have to do is ask." My gaze darted around the coffee shop, searching desperately for a sign of absurdity, for anyone to back me, but their eyes had diverted, and I was left tethered to this strange, grim pact looming at the fringes of sanity. "What are you talking about?" I challenged, although I sounded more confused than defiant. She leaned closer still, and I felt the unmistakable sting of desperation and danger weaving through the air. "I know people think I smell bad, but you don't understand. There are demons where you can't see, they cling to people who let them in. I've held them back. You don't have to live with that fear." I shook my head, shifting back in my chair, but she moved closer until her breath grazed my face. "Let me show you." I couldn't shake the sensation sprinting up my spine, her hand twitched like it was beckoning me to reach out. Then it was as if the world around us fell away, like I was in a dark vessel with no exit, feeling hovering eyes that weighed heavy upon my back. The scent, the woman, everything converged into a living nightmare before it struck me how wretchedly hopeless I felt. Was it wrong to reject her? Was I complicit in her suffering? The air was thick with a bittersweet kind of tension, like looking in the mirror and not recognizing who stared back. And in that fleeting moment, I could hear whispers creeping down the edges of reality, muddying the waters of my sanity. "You could run," she was saying, "but wouldn't you be curious? Wouldn't you want to know what you push away, what you so readily abandon in your comfortable life?" Every instinct screamed at me to say no, to refuse, to go back to my latte and the momentary safety of shallow pleasantries, but I felt something else kindle inside me. I leaned slightly closer, just a breath as I murmured, "What do I need to do?" The laughter returned, twisted and sharp, but then her expression shifted, and she froze, eyes glimmering with sanity and chaos interspersed. "Nothing, really. Just acknowledge what is around you. Just for one moment." And then in that celebrated whiplash, I gasped as she broke into a wide grin and suddenly the cafe fell silent. I twisted my head around like a puppet on strings to see what lay behind me, but there wasn't anything there, just the reflective glass that taunted my confusion. "Your demons are real, but they take many shapes," she continued, voice low and mesmerizing, and in that inward feeling, the vibrations of anxiety raced up my throat. The key suddenly felt immensely heavy in her hand, like it was holding a world I couldn't comprehend. "Acknowledge them, and you might find what really haunts you isn't me at all." And just like that, a shiver coursed up my spine, underlining the unsettling reality that perhaps I shouldn't have pushed her away, perhaps I would walk out of this coffee shop and carry her stench with me, her essence following, wrapped around my neck like a noose tightening with every breath. What turned from laughter shifted back to suspicion again, and the weight of the moment crashed down, but it was too late. I was scared, held captive by the disconcerting truth behind my own choices, and as the crowd connected with fleeting uncertainty, this woman, in her tattered raincoat, had opened the door to something buried deep within. Darkness doesn't require permission, it just waits in the shadows, waiting to devour you whole while you dismiss those looking for refuge, blurring the lines between safety and fear. I straightened, the coffee shop's familiarity almost gone, as her stormy eyes implored me to see beyond my aversion. And deep down, as the rain thrummed against the windows and people shifted in their chairs, I realized I might have made a choice in that moment, a choice that I would come to reckon with long after we parted ways. The coffee shop could never provide the safety I craved, only a fleeting mask over hidden truths. My heart raced in anticipation of what lay beyond, and I suddenly needed more than just my latte. I needed to discover the depths of those demons lurking just out of sight, ready to carve a path I wouldn't soon forget. When my mom told us she was marrying Gary, the first thought that crossed my mind was disbelief. It wasn't even a month since Dad had walked out, leaving us shattered and frail, and now she was inviting a stranger into our lives, a man whose mere presence made my skin crawl. Initially, I tried to be supportive, brushing aside my gut feelings as selfishness, so I told myself that maybe this was her way of coping, a distraction from our family's collapse. But as the weeks dragged on, it became agonizingly clear that Gary was not just a temporary figure in our lives, he was here to stay. He brought along with him a chilling entitlement, like the world belonged to him, and as he forced his way through our family, I felt more like a visitor in my own home, an intruder watching the landscape of my childhood warp under his influence. The first time he yelled at me for leaving my shoes in the hallway, I told him it was no big deal. I was tired of the fighting, the sorrow of our broken family, but something deep inside me snapped. It was the way he stood there, his hands on his hips, like he was ready to bulldoze through whatever shred of dignity I had left. That night, as he slept blissfully beside my mother, I imagined him waking to find his face painted with my dad's words, the ones that had left our family in tatters. I wanted to scream at her about the mistake she was making, how he would never fill the void Dad left behind, but every time I tried, the words choked me, turning my voice into whispers drowned in my fear of breaking her already fragile heart. Yet, there came a moment, just a fleeting moment, as she cooked dinner one night, hinting at another family trip, that the rage boiled over. With my fist clenched and my heart racing, I yelled, "You'll regret picking him over us." The silence that followed was palpable. I thought she might throw something or, at the very least, give me a stern talking to, but instead, she froze, her spatula midair, eyes wide and glazed with shock. I felt as if I had fired a bullet into my own heart, and when she finally spoke, her voice was so small it broke me. "We need a new beginning, and I'm not asking for your approval." Those words hung heavily in the air, stinging like a slap when they settled around us. It was a bitter realization that my childhood was effectively over. In her eyes, I was just a child holding on to the past like a toddler with a ragged security blanket, while she wished for rebirth into this new life with Gary. What followed was a spiral, a slow, excruciating descent into a reality I hadn't signed up for. Gary installed webcams around the house, claiming it was for our safety, but it felt more like a prison, as if the walls had ears to report every tiny dissent I dared to voice. He would smirk when Mom wasn't looking, his gaze slicing through me like a knife. Every meal became a twisted game of familial chess, his oily laughter ringing in my ears as Mom cooked for him, entirely ignoring my existence. I spent nights lying awake in bed, replaying that moment, wishing I had said something else, anything else, to sway her away from him, but every offer of concern bounced off her like rain on a roof. Then one fateful night, as I lay there contemplating another day of uneasiness under Gary's rule, I heard a commotion coming from the living room. I crept out of bed, heart thumping, to find him yelling at Mom, who was crying as she tried to reason with him, her voice cracking. I wanted to rush in, to yell at him to leave her alone. Instead, I froze, paralyzed with fear. That was when she let it slip, slightly drunken, her guard down, that she didn't want us anymore. It was a bomb going off in my chest. I stumbled back into my room, tears burning my cheeks. It was like the ground had opened to swallow me whole. I thought about how far we could fall as a family, about how Gary would exploit this weakness, so when Gary struts into my room a few days later, waving a crumpled paper, I half expected him to tell me about a new rule. Instead, he smirked and said, "I'm adopting you, kiddo. It's about time you accepted this." That's when I snapped. I realized I had been a puppet, letting them walk all over my hurt, so I shouted back, "You're not my father." The ensuing silence felt oddly nostalgic, as if anyone could hear each shattered fragment of my resolve play out. That's when something deep and ancient within me awoke, a primitive response to defend against the encroaching darkness. I confronted my mom one last time, trembling but determined. I addressed the reality with her, recalling moment after moment of her dismissive disbelief. "You won't be happy with him," I said, every word laced with an urgency rooted in pure love for my family. "He doesn't care about you, he treats you like some pathetic plaything." I'll never forget the moment her eyes darkened, a storm brewing beneath the surface as she spat back, "You are too young to understand love." A flicker of regret crossed my mind when I bolted, stomping upstairs, but I held on, convincing myself this was my last act of defiance. The following week, I stood in front of my old friends at school, sharing my story, trying to piece together the shattered remains of my heart. They listened, some nodding, others swiping tears away, their empathy wrapping around me like a balm, healing the jagged edges that Gary and Mom had left behind. But just as I began finding strength in their kindness, I received a message from my mom, an ominous text saying she didn't want to speak with me again. I felt gutted but also invigorated, the urgency to protect my fading family now morphing into a will to break free. I started planning a life without the continued weight of a reality tethered to Gary, until one day, my phone buzzed with the dreaded news: Mom had taken off with Gary, leaving everything behind. Maybe she saw it coming, or maybe she was always willing to trade legitimate love for empty promises. And in that moment, as I stood in the remnants of a life long stifled, I realized, perhaps I was wrong to claim she would regret her choices. The devastation of my truth had always belonged to her, driving me forward as the weight of her choices shattered my once unbreakable spirit. As I sit here writing this, the heaviness of the loss smarting in my chest, I can't help but wonder, in a way, if she did regret it, for in gaining a husband, she lost her children, and that emptiness is louder than any curse cast upon her. When I was 13, my family took me to visit my cousin Chloe, who lived in a small town where rumors wrapped around old houses like thick vines, and where the wind seemed to be a constant whisper of secrets. I adored Chloe. She was always the life of the party, brimming with laughter and confident chatter. But that summer night, everything changed when I ventured into the unfamiliar shadows of her house, seeking the solace of her bedroom, where old posters flaked on the walls and scented candles struggled against the oppressive humid air. Chloe's boyfriend, Tom, was there, and he wore an unsettling grin. "You should really see how easy it is to summon spirits," he said, a spark of something darker glittering in his eyes. I shrugged it off, trying to focus on the flickering candlelight, but his words festered, like a nest of wasps in my gut. Later that night, after he shoved a chair beneath the window and claimed to have called the dead by their first names, we gathered around the small table, Tom urging us to play a game, an innocent enough guise, but I could tell he was feeding off my unease. Chloe twirled her hair, oblivious to the dread crawling up my spine, but despite my protests, curiosity clawed at me until I felt I had no choice but to give in. As we joined hands in a circle, Tom began talking to the darkness, inviting any entity to join us, while a chill seeped into the room. A pressure hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as the candles flickered wildly and the temperature dropped. I shuddered, desperately wishing for a way out, when a flash of cold wind swept through the eerily still air, and the lights flickered, sending all three of us sprawling in panic against the wall. I thought I saw it, a shadow darting behind Tom, and I swear, for a brief moment, I could feel the breath of something unfathomable on my neck. "Stop it," I shouted, the pitch of my voice breaking. Chloe shot me a hurt look as Tom smirked, clearly reveling in my unease. I didn't like the way he looked at her, like she was nothing more than a pawn to be manipulated in his sick game. When I finally pulled away, running down the dimly lit hallway with pounding footsteps, I felt something cold and unyielding grip my heart, like the hand of whatever he had conjured. I stumbled out of the house, frantically kicking stones in the gravel driveway, determined to put distance between me and Tom's sinister antics. As I walked away, I lost track of time, my senses overwhelmed by the buzzing of cicadas and the distant murmur of wind slipping between the trees. I thought, foolishly, that I could shake the feeling of dread, but in the pit of my stomach, I felt I had made a mistake. By leaving, I had done something wrong. But suddenly, a loud crash echoed behind me, and I turned to see the front door swing open, Chloe stumbling out, tears streaming down her face. "Why did you leave?" she wailed, her breath hitching. I could barely form a response, the morbid reality sinking in. Before I could say anything, she yelled, "You made him angry." Confusion overwhelmed me as she explained how Tom had followed me, his demeanor shifting from smug to furious in seconds. I wanted to retreat into my own thoughts but couldn't. Her anguish was palpable, igniting guilt for a decision I'd made. "You shouldn't have played that game," she cried, her body trembling. Moments later, Tom stepped out onto the porch, his expression morphing eerily from anger to something chillingly vacant. "This is all your fault," he said, voice eerily devoid of emotion, before he slammed the door shut. It felt surreal, like being trapped in a waking nightmare, where reality began to fray at the edges. The sound of the waves crashing in the distance melded with Chloe's sobs. I attempted to comfort her, but it didn't help. It felt like I was trying to stop a tidal wave with my bare hands. What happened next is a blur. A strange stillness settled in the air, wrapping around us as if the universe itself paused to hold its breath. Chloe's phone buzzed violently, and she snatched it up, eyes widening. "It's Tom," she whispered, trembling. The heavy air thickened as she pressed the phone to her ear. I stood frozen, the world blurring around me as I listened to her end of the conversation. "No. Please, Tom. Don't say that," she begged, her voice breaking. When she finally hung up, her face was drained of color, a ghostly pallor that terrified me. "He's done," she whispered hollowly, and for the first time, I felt fear gripping not only for her but for what lurked just beyond the threshold of normalcy. It turned out that every time I left a room, every time I faltered, it incited a violent reaction in Tom. The shadows had answered his desperation. He wasn't just losing Chloe, he was losing himself, and in that moment, it felt like a dark loop had eclipsed our lives. I felt as if I had stumbled into a living horror story, where the protagonist's decision to run away from danger only served to amplify the horror for those left behind. Days turned into months, and Chloe would later describe that night as the beginning of the end. She could still hear him speaking in tongues, lost in the dark magic of old stories he shouldn't have touched, and somehow I felt responsible. It wasn't a clear-cut evil, no one died that night, but in her eyes, I could see the shadow crawl deeper, and I knew I had done something irrevocable. My heart ached with the weight of knowing that every sob escaping her lips felt like a piece of the blame sinking into my chest. Each encounter felt haunted, and every family gathering turned sour. The laughter morphed into daggers each time I saw Tom in the corner, wearing an expression of abandonment. He unleashed chaos in a white-hot rage, and soon after, their relationship crumbled, but the repercussions reverberated through Chloe's life like thunder. Was I really an asshole for leaving, or was it merely a breath before the descent into madness? It's hard to differentiate what's tangible and what's not when you're marking the boundaries of your sanity. While we navigate the dim corridors of our past longing for the light, sometimes the door you think leads to the safety of the outside world becomes the very breach through which darkness floods in, and the shadows inside you will haunt you long after you think you've escaped. I still wonder whether the real spirits were the stories we buried, too terrified to admit that they lived not only in the shadows of the night but eternally within us. I was never the kind of person who took pleasure in stirring the pot, but the strange events that unfolded on my parents' land last autumn left me questioning everything I thought I knew about our little corner of the world, and myself. You see, every morning, I'd take my dog, Max, for a stroll along the well-trodden paths through the woods behind our house, an area usually filled with the comforting sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls, but October was different. The chill in the air held an edge, and the atmosphere turned thick with tension. Hunting season had begun, and with it came whispers of unease among the townsfolk. My parents warned me to steer clear of the usual hunting spots, but to be honest, I thought they were overreacting. After all, this was our family land, and what right did a couple of hunters have to dictate where I could walk my dog? 2 weeks into October, as orange leaves fluttered down like nature's confetti, I decided to ignore my parents' cautious advice. It was a crisp Saturday morning when I leashed up Max and headed out towards the back trails. I felt empowered, determined to reclaim my daily ritual, but as we strolled deeper into the woods, a creeping sensation clawed at my spine. Maybe it was just unease from my parents' warnings, maybe it was simple instinct, but something felt off. The woods suddenly seemed alive with unspoken secrets. My heart raced as we rounded a bend in the path and I noticed a tree stand, a crude wooden platform nestled high among the branches of an ancient oak, unmoving but for the sway of the tree. Something made me hesitate as I scanned the area, watching. An irrational part of me considered turning back, but then I saw him, a figure clad in camo, sitting stoically within the confines of the stand, a hunting rifle resting against his knee. He didn't seem to notice us at first, but as I pulled Max closer, I caught a glimpse of what lay beneath that camouflage. His eyes, cold and calculating, focused sharply on me. My skin prickled as the tension in the air intensified, and Max whimpered beside me, ever the sensitive companion. I made the snap decision to keep walking, hoping that if I ignored him, he would do the same. I felt foolish, but it was just a tree stand and a hunter. I had every right to be there. Yet, no sooner had we strolled past the tree than a sharp snap echoed through the quiet woods, like a twig being crushed underfoot. My heart dropped into my stomach. I turned to see the hunter had shifted slightly, almost as if he were adjusting his grip on the rifle, but something felt incredibly wrong. There was a predatory quality to his calm demeanor, a languid patience, like a lion sizing up an unsuspecting gazelle. I picked up the pace, clenching the leash tighter as a wave of primal fear washed over me. Max trotted beside me, seemingly sensing the change in energy, his tail low and his ears alert. I didn't dare look back. I was on my parents' land, I reminded myself again and again, but it was no longer comforting. The sensation of being hunted kept gnawing at my thoughts, and dread mingled with the crisp autumn air as every snap of a twig sent my pulse racing. Just before we reached the clearing, a voice called out, gravelly and low, shattering the suffocating silence and sending a jolt through my body. "Hey! You shouldn't be here." It was the hunter. I could feel his eyes boring into my back as I quickened my pace toward the fence that marked the boundaries of our property. "This area's reserved. Get lost." I didn't stop or respond, my pulse hammering in my ears, and then, impossibly, I heard a low chuckle, a sound so sinister it might as well have been a growl. That chuckle echoed in my mind long after it faded into the distance, and with it, a realization began to settle like a weight in my chest. I was in danger far beyond what I'd anticipated. I reached the boundary of our land and felt the familiar relief wash over me, but when I turned back, instinctively looking for trouble, the tree stand seemed impossibly empty. There was no sign of him, it was as if he had melted away into the shadows of the woods. I didn't sleep well that night. Shadows from where my dreams should have been stalked me, wrestling me deeper into a pit of anxiety. The next day I tried to explain to my parents, but they waved my concerns away as the ramblings of a paranoid child. "People are just doing their thing," my father said over breakfast. "You know how the hunters can get." But I had seen something that twisted at the seams of what normal meant. My instincts screamed at me to stay away from the woods, but part of me felt stubbornly drawn back. I needed to confront whatever specter hovered in those trees. The following weekend, I donned my bravest face and headed out again, this time brimming with anger rather than trepidation. Max was at my side once more as we traversed the path, though I felt every heartbeat thrumming through my veins like a war drum. I glanced towards that tree stand, convinced that somehow, impossibly, he was watching me again. "You hear me?" I shouted into the forest, the bravado masking the fear lacing through me. "You can't scare me off my own land." Silence hung, and though my voice rang back at me, I knew I wasn't alone. The shadows felt thicker, and the chill surging through the air seeped right to my bones. It became a twisted game between us. I walked the path, the sense of being hunted curling around me like a predator, watching, waiting. This went on for weeks, each time edging further and further from rationality, caught in the throes of an unnameable dread. Days turned to weeks and the hunter became more than just an encounter. He was a specter, a nightmare made manifest. I would see him in fleeting glimpses through the trees, a flash of camouflage here, a flicker of movement there. The forest became a stage of lurking terror, and one fateful day, with the sun dipping low and shadows elongating, I finally snapped. I took Max and charged across the clearing directly towards the stand, feeling reckless and defiant. "Show yourself," I yelled, hands shaking, ready to face whatever darkness awaited me. Those cold eyes finally met mine from the lofty height above. He emerged, stepping lightly down, and for the first time, I could see his face, gaunt and unshaven, with a smile that didn't look human, a predatory grin laced with a chaotic glint. "Mighty brave of you to come here," he rasped, his voice dripping with a chilling amusement. "You think you have more claim to this land than I do?" Panic exploded in my gut, overwhelming my ability to reason as I took a step backward, but my dog growled, stepping protectively in front of me. I pressed on instinctively wanting to protect him as well. "This is my family's land," I spat, though doubts gnawed at my resolve. "You're nothing but a trespasser." Each word sliced through the air like a knife, but he merely laughed, dark and unrelenting. "I've seen you walking here, dog and all. You think I just go away because you're here? This is my haunt now." The way he said haunt struck a chord deep within. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't turn my back on this monster. "You don't own this place," I rotated, letting anger guide me through fear, "and you're not welcome here." His smile widened, a rictus that hung heavy in the air like some malevolent omen. "You think you can keep me away?" He snarled dangerously, and that puzzle that had haunted me weeks fell into place. This wasn't just about hunting, it was a war over territory, dominance, the very essence of survival. I knew I had to escape, that lingering fear curling around my throat as I found a moment of doubt. He was just a hunter, surely he wouldn't cross any lines? But just then, the echo of footsteps drew near, and I turned to see my parents coming down the path. Relief flooded through me until I saw the confusion in their eyes. "What's going on?" my father called, but the hunter merely cocked his head, an utterly soulless look in his gaze. This land should have been theirs long ago, he whispered venomously, but sometimes, the strong take what they want. I felt my breath seize in my throat. I didn't know what I could do. He might have been a man, but he loomed larger than life, a specter of dread that had haunted my every waking moment. Run, I shouted at my parents, desperately trying to shield them as panic clawed at my chest, but they were rooted. Fear had snagged them as much as it had ensnared me. What are you doing? My mother cried, but that devil's grin sucked the breath from my lungs. I turned to Max, and as if sensing the impending danger, the little dog barked furiously, a fierce protector as he lunged toward the figure that towered over us. And in that instant, I knew, I wasn't the only one he wanted to claim. Everything twisted around me then, screams pierced the stillness as my mind spiraled into chaos, fragmenting like an old, broken mirror, clawing back toward the safety of the woods I had defended in the first place. But what had once felt like refuge now echoed with the sinister knowledge that the hunter would always be hungering for more. As night fell, my parents finally understood, and I was left racing while the woods closed in behind us, a chilling reminder that in this game of survival, sometimes stepping forward meant crossing a line you could never uncross. We might have escaped with our lives, but the terror of that encounter clings to me still, a constant reminder of the haunting truth. Sometimes, it's not just the land that gets claimed, but our very own sanity that follows suit. And every now and then, when the wind howls just right, I can still hear that terrible laughter echoing through the woods, reminding me that I wasn't just trespassing on land but wandering into a realm where the hunter never really stops hunting. I always thought my family was strange, but I never expected that the looming shadow of my father's estate would unravel everything I thought I knew about loyalty, love, and sanity. My father, still alive but battling a relentless illness that had reduced him to a mere ghost of the man he once was, owned a sprawling piece of land, a crumbling farmhouse with more history than charm, and a collection of oddities that filled every nook and cranny of the place. After years of being an outcast in my own family, my brother Alex returned with a gleam in his eye and a desperate need for money, which he insisted my father should have already divided. "He won't need it after he's gone," he told me one night as the shadows gathered in the corners of our dimly lit living room. I felt an odd chill, not from the cold, but from the look in his eyes that seemed almost predatory. He wanted me to agree to sell a portion of our father's land, a decision I found ghastly. I couldn't bear the thought of discussing finances so soon. My father was still with us, albeit slipping away by the day. "You're being selfish," Alex snapped, his voice tinged with a venom that echoed through the stillness. I could hear my father's labored breathing from the next room, a constant reminder that he was fighting his own battles, and in the throes of denial, I clung to what little was left of our family unit. The days that followed grew darker, with my brother returning at odd hours, constantly trying to charm me into seeing things his way, all the while casting angry glances at our father, as if the old man's mere existence was a blight on his plans. Conflicted, I found myself venturing into the attic to escape the familial tension, combing through dusty boxes filled with fragmented memories, discovering strange letters, some of them detailing occult practices that seemed out of place among my father's mundane possessions. Flickering candlelight from an old lantern illuminated my father's poetry, haunting verses about loss and existence, which sent chills down my spine, making me question not just Alex's motives but the very nature of what it means to own something so deeply personal. Then came the night everything changed. I woke to the sound of chanting, low and insidious, echoing through the halls of the farmhouse. In a daze, I stumbled down the creaky stairs, compelled by some unseen force to investigate. The living room was bathed in an eerie glow. Alex stood at the center, surrounded by candles casting elongated shadows that writhed against the walls like living things. His eyes were unfocused, a manic glint shimmering as he gripped a large, intricately carved pentacle that had once belonged to our father, the very emblem of what was left of our family legacy. "You don't understand what's at stake," he pleaded, a frenzy edging his voice as if he were channeling some otherworldly energy. "The estate belongs to us, but not for long if he passes. I need you to help me." Before I could respond, a low thrum reverberated from the floor beneath us, intensifying. My father's anguished groans wafted through the air, merging with the incantations that spilled from my brother's lips, forming a grotesque echo vibrating through my very bones. Paralyzed by fear, I finally found my voice, screaming at Alex to stop, but the words were lost in the hollow space as the lights flickered and the shadows convulsed. It was then that I saw it, the grotesque, distorted face of our father reflected in the window, lips moving in silent horror as if he were begging for release from the grip of his son's madness. With a surge of adrenaline, I lunged for the pentacle, desperately yanking it from Alex's grasp, its edges burning against my palm. The moment I touched it, reality split apart like brittle glass. A cacophony erupted in the room, a sound that scraped the insides of my skull. I was thrown back, landing hard against the wooden floor, breath knocked from my lungs, as shadows swarmed over me with suffocating wrath, eager to consume. The last thing I remember was the sight of Alex, eyes wide with terror, unsure whether to flee or fight against the amalgamation of forces we had unleashed. When I returned to consciousness, the house felt different, heavier, charged with an anxiety I couldn't place. I scrambled to my feet, scanning the room as frail wisps of the past whispered through the air, muddled memories piercing the haze. I found my father in his bed, gasping, the lines on his face deepening as if aged by decades in just hours. Desperate to salvage what remained of my family, I pleaded with him for answers, for something to cling to that wasn't shrouded in fear. Instead, he gripped my hand with surprising strength, a grave expression washing over his features, as he confessed dark family secrets, the endless cycle of greed and loss, a dreadful once-committed pact stretching back generations that led to despair, forever binding us to that estate. My brother had stumbled upon that darkness, and though he thought he could wield it, the truth was evil wasn't meant to be controlled. I raced to find Alex, but he was gone. The house echoed with madness coursing through its walls, crawling in every shadow and corner. I could feel the energy swirling around me, wrapping tighter as though the very land was rejecting me for refusing to play into its sinister game. Alone, forbidden even to call for help, I was left to confront what had transpired, the eerie weight of despair pressing down like an anchor to the abyss. My only choice was to confront the terrifying legacy of my lineage, but I wouldn't make the same mistakes. I resolved to protect my father's estate, to honor his last wishes, even if that meant facing the darkness alone, because I finally understood. Before any of it was mine, it belonged to the shadows beneath the surface, and they would only grow stronger if I followed my brother down that road. AITA for refusing to sell my father's estate and distribute the money? Maybe. But when your brother dances with devils, walking away might just be the only way to survive. I never thought I would reach a point where I had to make a post like this, but here I am, desperate for validation on whether I'm the asshole in this twisted situation. It all started last spring when my brother, Mark, began showing up unannounced at my apartment. At first, I thought it was just a minor inconvenience. He'd drop in with some lame excuse about needing to borrow a tool or ask for advice on his car, but as weeks passed, his visits morphed from casual to obsessive. It wasn't long before I noticed things started to feel off. He'd expertly manipulate the conversation to shift focus to my life, probing about my job, my friendships, my love life, as if gathering data to fuel some hidden agenda. I brushed it off as sibling curiosity at first, shrugging it away until that one fateful afternoon I came home from work to find my door wide open. Panic washed over me as I rushed inside, heart racing, to find my apartment completely intact. But there, in the living room, was a note rested on my coffee table, scrawled in shaky handwriting, "You need to be more open to me." It unnerved me more than I could express. Was I being paranoid? I decided to confront him, and when I did, Mark laughed it off, insisting I was reading too much into it. But I was no longer comfortable with him just popping by whenever he felt like it. I needed my space. So, after much deliberation, I made the decision to change the locks. When I told him, he looked at me, the laughter draining from his face, replaced by something colder, darker. He said nothing but walked away, a shadow crossing his features. A week later, I woke up in the dead of night to the distinct sound of my door jiggling. My heart pounded as I froze in fear, listening carefully, praying it was just an old pipe or a figment of my imagination. But no, the rattling persisted for what felt like hours, and then it stopped suddenly. The silence was deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was just outside, waiting for the right moment to breach my sanctuary. I buried myself in my blankets, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but deep down I knew. Mark was relentless. The next morning, I found more notes scattered around my apartment, all manner of things from "I just want to help" to "Why can't you see I'm your only family?" It was suffocating, the pervasive sense of dread that began to chase me through my days. I felt trapped in a nightmare, and the lines of love and manipulation blurred until there was nothing left but darkness. I decided to take action. I went to the police station and filed a report. They couldn't do much, just a recognized nuisance, they said. As I left, I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. I couldn't even trust the people who were supposed to protect me. Every break in my routine, every sound outside my window incited pure terror. I looked for any chance to escape, weekend getaways, late-night shifts, anything to avoid the haunting presence of my brother. And then one stormy evening, with thunder rumbling and rain pouring like the sky itself was breaking apart, someone banged on my window. It was Mark, drenched and grinning in a way that set off alarm bells in my mind. Surprise. I thought I'd come over to help you with that article you're working on. The sickening jolt of dread coursed through my veins. I stumbled backwards, my heart racing as I quickly mumbled something and darted to the door, locking it just as he reached for the handle. But I could see him through the peephole, my own brother. His grin widened, but his eyes were wild, icicles of twisted madness in the torrential downpour. With every thump of his fist against the door, the world outside blurred, leaving only a whirlpool of confusion and fear. I was losing my grip, feeling as if I was slipping into some alternate reality. Was I the villain for wanting space? Was it wrong to feel caged by someone who claimed to love me, or was I just pushing him away? I yelled at him to leave, realizing too late the trap I had walked into, his soft chuckle echoing unnervingly through the night. But I'm your family. We're supposed to be close. I finally lost it, my voice cracking as I screamed, aren't you supposed to care about what I want? And just like that, the laughter stopped. Mark's expression shifted, his mouth tightened as he said, you think you can change the locks on family? You can't escape me. I bolted to my bedroom, fumbling for my phone, but as I turned, I saw him standing in my living room, having somehow slipped through a window I thought I had locked. My breath caught in my throat as he said very calmly, it's not just the lock settling the score, sis. You need to learn that family always finds a way in. Then everything went black. When I finally regained consciousness, I was sprawled on the floor of my apartment with no memory of what happened next, but one thing was clear, in that moment, I truly understood what it meant to be the scapegoat in a family tied tighter than the strongest chain, each link weighed down with the burden of madness. My brother was no longer just a sibling, he had become something beyond that, something dangerous, twisted. Now, as I sit here, typing this, I can't help but wonder if I did the right thing by confronting him, changing the locks, and asking him to stay away. But the truth is, I still hear his laughter echoing through the walls, and that little voice keeps haunting me. AITA for telling my brother to stop coming unannounced? I think I might be the biggest fool for thinking I could change the locks on the chains binding us. I remember the day my friend Jay gave me the expensive clothes like it was etched into my mind, a vibrant blur of silk and stitch set against the mundane backdrop of my cluttered apartment. Jay was a fashion influencer, strutting through life like a peacock, draped in designer pieces that sparkled in the sunlight. We met in college, two misfits who bonded over weird hobbies and alternative music, and just when I thought I was past the days of scraping by, Jay surprised me with bags overflowing with items from his latest collaboration, luxury clothes that danced around their own presence with excellence. My heart swelled at the gift. I didn't just see clothes, but a ticket to a world I felt I could never belong to, a place where confidence dripped from every seam. For weeks, I wore those clothes like armor, striding through life with newfound bravado. Friends, acquaintances, even strangers complimented me, their kind words wrapping around me like a warm embrace as I reveled in the prestige those clothes brought. But as my inner circle of friends began to dwindle, whispers ran through our group. Some suggested I sell them for a quick buck, pieces like that fetched sky-high prices, they said, while others told me horror stories about friends who had borrowed expensive items and ruined them. One night, over too many cheap beers and too much bravado, I decided to post the clothes online, just to see what interest might spark, but when I woke up that morning, I felt sick at the thought. Jay had spat out warnings about the pitfalls of selling gifts, their possessions no longer, and the moment you let them go, something within you starts to wither just like that little green plant in my apartment that never thrived. The next day, Jay texted me, asking if I'd reconsider. His tone was neither accusing nor pleading, simply curious, had I really done it? I agonized, my stomach twisting like a kite caught in the wind, and the guilt clawed at me like a feral cat. I texted back, I didn't sell it, I just thought about it. His response was cool, but something flickered in the back of my mind. Was he disappointed? That afternoon, I received an unexpected call from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end sent a chill down my spine, a low, gravelly tone that pierced through the average daytime noise. It's important you meet me, it rasped, and something deep in my gut screamed danger. I hung up, my heart racing like a train on a crooked track, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It gnawed at me for days. Then came the confrontation over dinner, the smells of pizza and soda fading into a background haze as Jay's voice cut through the silence. "You need to sell them, you're missing the opportunity here," he urged, but there was something darker behind his eyes, the flicker of something almost predatory, and as I lifted my glass, I realized that his grip on the table trembled slightly. "You don't get it. I can't take something precious and just throw it away," I reasoned, but he leaned closer, and I was struck by an icy claw of fear. "They don't belong to you," he hissed, his fingers curling like talons around the remnants of his slice of pizza, and I felt that inexplicable emptiness inside me flare into something jagged and immense. Later that night as I tossed and turned, my phone buzzed like a vibrant insect in the darkness. It was Jay, asking me for a photo of the clothes, seemingly innocent, but I could feel that disturbing edge underneath, coiling tighter around my mind. Caught between paranoia and friendship, I decided to ignore it, but my reluctance spiraled into an insatiable paranoia as every knock on my door echoed through my dreams. Weeks crawled by, and out of nowhere, I began receiving mysterious messages, strangers reaching out claiming to know Jay, their words slick with venom that suggested I needed to wear those clothes again or risk facing a spiritual wrath. The clothes, I learned, bore an offense only those deep in the fashion underworld could understand. They weren't mere garments, they were trophies of popularity, each thread woven from the hopes and struggles of those who desired fame before me. What had I stumbled into? I wondered, but every time I tried to confront Jay, he sidestepped me, elusive and disquietingly charming. One evening, in an effort to reclaim control, I turned on the lights in my living room and held the clothes hostage in plain sight, confronting them like they were sentient beings with an unholy agenda. I snapped a picture, half expecting to see demons lurking around the edges of the frame. Days passed in a muffled haze, but then came the night. It was stormy, the wind howling like a pack of lost souls. I sat on my couch with a glass of wine, considering burning them rather than selling them, my heart drumming with the rhythm of fear and guilt. That's when the phone rang, eyes wide. I answered, and it was Jay again, frantic and clawing. "You want your life back. You have to wear them. If you don't, you'll never be free," he screamed through the receiver, almost incoherent. I felt tears prick at my eyes as I hung up, a tempest of panic swelled, but an insidious part of me wondered if wearing the clothes would liberate me from the shackles that had been tightening around my heart. Just that night, amid crashing thunder, I slipped into the most regal piece Jay had gifted me. Instantly, a wave of euphoria washed over, making me feel alive and powerful. The clothes wrapped around me like an embrace that transcended simple aesthetics. But as dawn approached and the light turned madly crimson, a creeping sensation clawed its way up my spine, and I caught a glimpse of myself in the old mirror. The reflection that looked back at me was distorted, twisted. It was Jay's face morphing into mine, wearing my own features in a grotesque parody. I felt the full weight of the clothes dragging me deeper into a void, and suddenly the price of acceptance became evident. The expensive threads were binding me to him. I stumbled back, ripping the clothes off as the fabric felt like razor blades against my skin, and while they landed in a heap on the floor, the moment they fell, the twisted vision vanished. Jay called for me again, begging, pleading, almost crying, and I went cold inside. I locked my door and tossed the clothes into the old furnace in my building's basement, adrenaline buzzing like a hive. Before I could feel relief, the pounding on my apartment door echoed through my mind. Jay, desperately wanting to reclaim what was his, but they weren't his anymore. "You can't throw them away. They're mine to control," he shouted, his voice breaking and unraveling into something almost pitiful. I didn't respond, just sat against the door, feeling the weight of both decisions crashing onto my shoulders. Hours crept by, and as the sun rose, I felt the tension lift as if a dark cloud had finally broken. But as I settled into that dawning tranquility, my phone buzzed with notifications, cold dread seeping back into my bones. Picture after picture poured in, Jay wearing them one by one, each snap more distorted and vengeful than the last. The final image etched a nightmare into my mind, Jay's face, grinning sickeningly as he held up a crude feedback board of my friends begging me to join them in this fashion parade, my reflection emerging from the depths of hell itself, a twisted war of dominance vibrant enough to burn the retina. At that moment, lying on my kitchen floor, I felt like I was ripped apart by threads of consequence and heartbreak. Jay wasn't just a friend anymore, he was a creature of desire, hungry for the essence that tethered me to the world I thought I understood. I was escalating into his warped image of fame, and all I could do was huddle in the corner of the room, wondering whether the price was too steep. It dawned on me then that the clothes hadn't just been a gift, they were a curse, a striking reminder that sometimes, when greed wraps its hands around your heart, it obliterates not just what you have but the familiar warmth of the person you thought you once knew. It was meant to be a simple first hangout, just me and Jenna, who I'd been crushing on since the moment I saw her in that crowded cafe, her laughter spilling like sunlight over the murky coffee, so when she invited me to a hike in the woods, I didn't think twice. I picked her up, my heart racing as I wondered if she'd notice my overenthusiastic cologne masking the scent of my nerves. The trail was gorgeous, dappled with autumn leaves, the air crisp and cool, and her presence felt electric, sending jolts of warmth through me even as the temperature dropped. As we trekked deeper into the woods, I found myself lost in conversation, trading stories about our childhoods and awkward high school moments, every laugh pulling us closer, every shared secret feeling like a pact. But as we reached a clearing glinting with sunlight, Jenna shivered slightly, wrapping her arms around herself. She glanced at my oversized sweater, and with a playful grin, she asked if she could borrow it, clearly not ready for the chill settling in as the sun dipped below the horizon. My instinct was to shrug it off and give it to her, but something about her request sent an icy tingle down my spine. Maybe it was that acute awareness of how easily one moment could shift into an entirely different reality. I hesitated, looking into her eyes, which flickered with both surprise and disappointment at my pause, and I finally said, "I think I'd rather not." It's, my favorite, which was a total lie, but I didn't know why I felt the need to withhold it. The flinch that crossed her face was subtle yet profound, but she quickly brushed it off, and we resumed our hike, the laughter now tinged with a hint of unease that I couldn't shake. The sun was almost gone, splattering the sky in streaks of orange and purple that felt surreal against the looming shadows that began to swallow the path we hadn't even realized we had ventured off. As we walked, the air turned heavy, and I noticed the woods felt different, as if everything was holding its breath, and I half wondered if the forest itself had come alive, watching our every step. We stumbled upon an old cabin, partially obscured by gnarled trees, its windows like empty eyes staring into the wilderness, and Jenna seemed drawn to it, almost against her will. I felt the instinct to grab her arm when she stepped towards the door, but it felt absurd. I wasn't her protector, just the guy who refused to give her my sweater. As if sensing my hesitation, Jenna turned to me, her expression eerily blank for someone who had just been speaking so animatedly. "Let's go check it out," she said with a tone that felt oddly detached, and despite every warning bell clanging in my mind, I followed her inside, the door creaking as if lamenting the intrusion. Inside, the air hung thick and musty, with wooden beams that groaned under the weight of years forgotten. Shadows cast by our flashlights flickered across the walls, revealing remnants of a life abandoned, a broken chair, dust-coated dishes piled in the corner. But one thing struck me as we explored: it felt wrong, almost like we had stepped into a scene that was not ours to witness. Jenna laughed suddenly, her voice echoing oddly in the silence, but when I turned to her, I saw that the darkness had drawn something out of her, her eyes dancing with a strange light that pulled at my gut. "I feel so liberated, don't you? Like we're breaking the rules," she said, her smile wide but unsettling, as if she was channeling some hidden energy swirling in the air. That was when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I backed away slowly, sensing something sinister lurking behind that innocent facade, but she caught me by the wrist, her grip firm yet fragile, a mix of desperation and allure. I wanted to pull away, to leave, but the intensity of her gaze held me in place, paralyzing with both fear and fascination. "Stay with me, just a bit longer," she whispered, and that was when I noticed shadows, long, curling shapes that seemed altogether too alive, creeping toward us from the corners of the cabin. Panic surged through me, the overpowering urge to flee clashing violently with my desire to keep Jenna close, but as I pried her fingers away and turned to run, a whisper echoed through the timbers, silky and suggestive yet dripping with malice: "You shouldn't have denied her the comfort of your warmth." I scrambled toward the door, my heart racing, but the shadows twisted and writhed, blocking my escape as Jenna's voice shifted, tinged now with desolation. "You'll regret this," she murmured, and beneath that familiar exterior, I caught a flicker of something else, something ancient and wrong that sent a chill ripping through my spine. As I finally shoved past the barrier of darkness and burst into the night, the weight of my decision crushed me. Was it worth it, not letting her borrow my sweater? The forest around me pulsed with an urgent energy as the last vestiges of light faded into the obsidian sky, and I sprinted back toward my car, glancing over my shoulder just once to see Jenna standing in the doorway of the cabin, her figure swallowed by shadows, but for a brief moment, she appeared almost ethereal, a desire woven into every sinew of her being. My heart clenched as I fumbled with my keys, entering the vehicle and slamming the door behind me, the haunting whispers still carving their way into my skull. I drove home in a daze, that night swirling in my mind as I grappled with what transpired, chills cascading down my body despite the warmth of my heater, wondering if I had just barely escaped something that could have consumed me whole. Now, days later, I replay the moment, obsession gnawing at my sanity, never quite shaken from the haunting image of Jenna, curiously beautiful yet impossibly insidious, but every time I try to shake off the fear, I hear her voice in my dreams, softly echoing, "You should have just let me wear your sweater." Thanksgiving had always been a family affair in my house, but this year felt different. This year, my husband eagerly announced his friend might be bringing her dog to dinner. Her dog, a strange hybrid mix of some kind of terrier and things I couldn't even identify, had a penchant for mischief, and as someone who had witnessed the aftermath of its chaotic visits in the past, I immediately felt a chill creep down my spine. From the moment I said no to the canine inclusion, an unseen tension crackled through the air like static electricity, my husband's face darkened, and a silenced argument bubbled beneath the surface. "It's just a dog," he'd insisted, but I couldn't shake the memories of Thanksgivings past where that little beast had devoured half of my cousin's pie and shredded a pillow beyond recognition while the adults were too distracted by football to notice. Besides, there was something unsettlingly unnatural about how that dog would stare at me from the corner of the room, its dark eyes boring into my soul, as though it were waiting, watching, plotting. In the days leading up to the dinner, I was met with accusations of being a dog-phobe, and while I had nothing against dogs in general, there was something profoundly off about this one. When Thanksgiving Day finally arrived, I found myself setting the table with a sense of dread, the silence of my reluctance hanging thick in the air. As my husband and his friend arrived, I noticed she wore this bizarre, almost victorious grin, as if the anticipation of chaos fueled her swagger. "You didn't really think she would have to leave her dog behind, did you?" She chuckled, throwing me a look that sent a shiver down my spine. The door swung open, and Toby, a name the dog bizarrely longed for, pranced into the house, his small body wiggling eagerly. I felt a knot form in my stomach as it darted around, sniffing everything, as if cataloging my life's most precious belongings. Dinner progressed amid the usual laughter and chatter, but I couldn't focus, my unease festered like a wound. That dog, now settled like a predator on a distant rack of bones, would occasionally fix me with its unsettling gaze, and each time I caught it watching me, the atmosphere warped around us. I started hearing whispers in the shadows, hushed tones that sent an ice-cold tremor through my bones, as if conversations were happening just out of sight, echoing thoughts that were never spoken aloud. The friendly barking morphed into something darker as the hours rolled on, and laughter turned hollow, every cheerful exchange gouging deeper into my consciousness, replacing comfort with creeping dread. At one point, while serving turkey, I looked up only to see Toby at my feet, staring, his pupils dilated to a menacing sliver. In that very moment, the power flickered, plunging us into darkness before the lights stubbornly returned, and suddenly it wasn't just the dog watching me, it felt as if something else lurked beneath the surface, hidden yet glaring. My eyes skimmed across the room, grasping for a shred of normalcy, only to lock onto Toby, who now seemed frozen, his body tense, poised as if preparing for something unspeakable. I forced a laugh when my husband and his friend joined me, but everything felt warped, strange, unsettling, a distortion of reality wrapped in familial love. When the dessert arrived, I felt the vibration of panic crawl through my fingertips as I skimmed across the table. I had baked a pumpkin pie my grandmother used to make. Just as I placed the pie down, Toby darted forward like a sprinter at the starting gun, sending the beautiful piece of pie flying to the ground, shattered into an unrecognizable mess. Everyone gasped, laughter dissolving into disbelief as my husband yelled, "Toby, no!" My pulse quickened, and in that instant of chaos, I felt an overwhelming sense of urgency, a silent signal that something was horribly wrong. The dog wasn't just clumsy, he was deliberate, and I desperately shouted, "Get that thing outside!" Something in my voice snapped through the tension, and as Toby was whisked away, I turned to see my husband's friend buckle in response. The joy she'd entered with had morphed into something closer to rage. "What's wrong with you?" she hissed, her voice suddenly low, laced with venom. The rest of the night was a blur of hurried movements and strained silences, the air humid with unspoken tension, until I finally noticed the flickering lights again, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls. The whispers grew, now harsh and chaotic, mocking me, taunting me. I couldn't shake the feeling we were trapped in some cruel play, and that little dog, no, that creature, was pulling the strings. Just as I thought the worst was over, the front door swung open, and I caught sight of Toby again, alone, sitting eerily still on the porch, head cocked at an angle, as if he had a message to deliver. My blood ran cold, an instinctual fear curling within me, and the room fell silent as everyone turned. "Where's your friend?" I choked out, my voice trembling. Just then, the atmosphere shifted, a cloud of apprehension flooded over us, washing away any last ounce of warmth. I glanced at my husband, only to see his face pale, eyes wide with terror. "She's got to be joking, right? She didn't go out there, did she?" he gasped, his mind racing. Time seemed to slow down. I had unintentionally opened a door to something dark and unfathomable, and as panic mounted, I braced myself in silence, a haunting thought spiraling within my mind. What had come into our lives alongside Toby? I kept searching for my husband's friend, but it felt as if she had vanished into the ether, a specter hidden among shadows. My heart raced wildly, the whispers louder now, seemingly orchestrating my descent into dread. I gathered the courage to open the front door, and what I saw snuffed the last flickers of hope from my mind. There, on the porch, was Toby, but the dog wore a face unmistakably adorned with blood, brighter than the crimson hues of falling leaves. What happened next unraveled everything. The shadows conspired, my husband stepped out, and in that instant, the world twisted, the line between human and beast blurred. I stood frozen as a deafening howl pierced the night. The laughter of my family became grotesque, mocking me, pulling me deeper into the oblivion. AITA. My once warm Thanksgiving dinner dissolved into echoes of despair, leaving me to wonder if my simple refusal had unleashed something far darker that lay nestled in the shadows, forever altering our lives, forever horror-drenching my innocent hopes. When my wife and I first decided to have a child, we envisioned a picture-perfect family life, complete with spontaneous road trips and Sunday barbecues, but reality is often sharper than expectations, and soon daily life morphed into a relentless grind dominated by one irritating truth. Our 3-year-old daughter, Emily, was a nighttime terror, waking up screaming from apparitions that seemed to haunt her dreams, and after several weeks of sleepless nights, I found myself wrestling with an increasingly impossible choice. So, when my wife, Jessica, suggested right after dinner one Tuesday that we start taking Emily to daycare, I felt like I was being edged toward the cliff of parental sanity. "She's sleepy," I thought. "She won't sleep at daycare, she'll scream for me." I braced myself for weeks of bargaining with a toddler over nap time, so when it was suggested that I take Emily to daycare, a mere 20-minute drive in the same direction Jessica takes each morning, I hesitated. The logic seemed to infuriate me. How would it save us time, really, when I could just keep her at home where we had a semblance of control over our lives? I could hear her tiny voice, coffee-stained with the innocence of childhood. "Daddy, please don't make me go." And it twisted my insides. I became emotionally overdrawn, my derailed thoughts split between tender affection for my little girl and the desperation of exhausted parents craving normalcy. In the end, feelings won, and after more sleepless nights than I could count, I blurted out, "AITA for not taking Emily to daycare when it's just a 20-minute drive in the same direction as you, Jess?" What followed was the kind of argument that left both our hearts pounding and eyes stinging with tears. She couldn't understand how I could deny our daughter some structure, something stable to ground her restless spirit. My reluctance, according to Jessica, was merely a selfish desire to pacify my own guilt. But every irritation piled like flammable kindling, till last week it burst into flames. Emily woke up again, shrieking about monsters, her eyes wild as if they were windows to a thrilling, chaotic nightmare, and I felt the heat rise in my chest while my wife hissed at me to make that drive to the daycare. I refused, heart racing, sweat forming on my brow, burying my head beneath the pillow, convinced if nothing else, at least she was safe with me. All the what-ifs clawed at me. What if I was a terrible father, a godforsaken monster who could not endure the screams of a scared child? I was alone in this decision, swimming in a tidal wave of guilt as each morning unveiled a fresh list of rear-end kisses. The shame burned bright, especially when Jessica resorted to the ultimate parent's leverage, silent treatment, and the bitterness festered, hardened into resentments neither of us embraced but neither could deny. Then came the night it happened. Emily woke me up, summoning me with trembling babbles, an unexplainable chill. lanced through me, almost sent me shivering out of bed. I went to her room and found her staring blankly at the walls. They seemed to breathe, swell, no, distort, whispering secrets in a language I didn't understand. "What's wrong, Emily?" I whispered, soothingly, but all I could manage was a stammer. She pointed to the window, lips quivering, and said, "Daddy, I don't like the closet anymore." The closet sat in darkness, ominous like a black mouth waiting to devour, and despite my instincts, I sat down next to her. After a few heart-wrenching moments, I dared to creep slowly towards the closet, swinging it open, only to find nothing, just clothes draping silently, shrouded like ghosts. I was about to close it when I noticed something unnatural, a reflection. For half a heartbeat, I thought I saw something flicker beyond the veil of silence, reaching for Emily's face, but then it vanished. I snapped it shut, and Emily cried. I wanted to gather her in my arms, to tell her it was going to be okay, but my voice cracked, fear clambering up my throat as I turned, surveying the room, convinced I had entered the realm of nightmares myself. For days, life twisted further out of alignment, the screams in the night returned, but now they spoke in strangled whispers, cryptic syllables turning my sweet girl into a captive of her own anguish. My resolve began to splinter when I suddenly understood that denying her aid would forever seal us in an embrace of despair, so in a fit of hopeless desperation that fateful Saturday morning, I relented, grabbed Emily, bundled her into the car, and we made that dreaded 20-minute drive to daycare, a measure of desperate hope dancing against the back of my mind. Yet, with my heart pounding, I saw that familiar chalkboard sign out front, announcing "We love our little ones." But beneath it was a smear of deep red, instincts blared alarms, and the moment we stepped inside, the air turned tainted, tinged with despair that felt like an iron fist squeezing my lungs. The children were there, faces blank as if they were marionettes in a play where no one knew the lines. I turned to my sweet girl, gripping my palm around her little hand, and together we approached the woman at the front desk, a nurse with eyes too soft, a smile too wide. "Time to play, sweet pea." She chimed, but I saw through it. I wasn't ready to leave Emily there, and though she kicked and cried, begging, "Don't go, Daddy," the nurse gripped her too tightly, coaxing her with promises of fun. As I stumbled back to my car, a weight settled around my shoulders. What if I was never coming back? My trembling hands held the wheel like a lifeline, feeling the screams from the back of my mind pressing down, reverberating against each gut reaction, like echoes ringing through dimly lit corridors. For hours, I wrestled between sanity and dread, each ticking second morphing into hourglass grains of despair. Each minute felt unendurable, anxiety coiling tighter until my fear ignited like fire, and the need to go back became irrational, overwhelming. I darted back to daycare in a terrifying frenzy, my heart racing in erratic tempo, but the moment I returned, everything changed. Emily was nowhere in the chaotic, sterile playroom, and the nurse was gone without a trace. In a panic, I scoured every corner, digging through the laughter that taunted my railed senses, dread seeping thick and curling around me as I pushed through the door to the playground, only to witness Emily sitting on the ground alone, her bright blue eyes fixed on the sky, whispering almost urgently to something, or someone. "Emily!" I screamed, fear devolving into a chilling hollowness rapidly spreading through my body. It wrapped itself around my throat like a rope. Her eyes were wide, too wide, staring into the abyss, and no one in that bleak daycare seemed to care. They all continued on, as if puppets on a string, tied to an inaudible rhythm while Emily's soft voice spoke urgently to the shadowed form at the edge of the playground. My heart slammed in its cage as dread crumpled around me. I rushed towards her, snatched her up against me, and that's when the figures leapt from the shadows, the pure innocence of her childhood spilling into oblivion as if to taunt me with the impending doom. I shouted her name once more, and suddenly, I felt the world tilt, the realm twisting with each breath as black threads surged through the space. In that moment, I understood, AITA for not taking Emily to daycare. No, it was far more sinister than that, for not heeding the warnings whispered through her dreams and mine. I didn't expect my life to twist into this nightmare the day my husband brought his daughter from his first marriage to live with us. She was only 10, and he thought that having her here would help mend the fractured relationship they had, but, honestly, I felt like a stranger in my own home. Sure, I cared about her, she was a kid, after all, but I wasn't ready to be a parental figure, especially not so soon after we got married, and I made that clear to him, only for him to dismiss my discomfort with comments about being a real family. The first week was a whirlwind of chaos. She arrived with a duffel bag full of clothes but left the rest of her emotional baggage in her soul, the kind nobody else sees until it starts to weigh heavy in the air between us. Her name was Lily, and her big, doe-like eyes always seemed to hold memories of something dark, something unspoken. I sometimes caught her staring out of the window, as if waiting for someone or something that would never come, even as she wore a forced smile. The problem wasn't just her sadness, it was the creeping sense of menace that seemed to follow her, like something from a horror movie. There were strange occurrences, like objects moving on their own, or the times we'd hear soft sobbing at night, which would just be her mumbling in her sleep, but it made me feel paranoid every time I had to check on her. What made things worse was the way my husband looked at her, the way his eyes softened. It made me feel as if I was slowly exiting the picture, replaced by a ghost of his past. One night, while I was supposed to be preparing dinner, I heard her whispering to what I thought was an empty room, and when I walked in, she paused, her fingers tracing the edge of a dusty old book that had mysteriously appeared on the floor. I asked her about it, but her answer made my skin crawl. She said, "It's from my friend," which chilled me to the bone. I brushed it off, but the sense of dread grew with each strange event. The pictures on the wall started to tilt during the night, and whispers would echo in the hallways, trapped in the silence like trapped souls. I found myself constantly wondering if I was losing it, yet every time my husband and I fought, she'd seem to smirk as if she was the one pulling the strings in our marital discord. It escalated when I was packing for a weekend trip, and I found my necklaces strewn across the floor, hung like strange trophies on a noose made of what I could only assume was her sick humor. That night, I had a nightmare, a vision of a shadowy figure lurking behind her, its fingers stretched toward me. I jolted awake to find Lily standing at the end of my bed, her face illuminated by the moon. She simply smiled at me, tilting her head like a dog who hears a distant sound, which sent a jolt of ice through my veins. I screamed, waking my husband, who dismissed my fears as a mom's unfortunate imagination running wild, even when I showed him the book she claimed was from her friend. He read it and laughed, calling it a children's story, but the illustrations alone filled my stomach with dread. It was all about a little girl who made a pact with something ominous, something that came to collect its debts in twisted forms. I kept my confrontations about Lily's behaviors and the odd happenings to myself. After all, I was the one deemed the villain, labeled the stepmother who wouldn't embrace this child. The final straw came when Lily began talking about her friend more frequently. "He's coming to visit," she'd say with a serene smile, her eyes gleaming like the reflection of the moon in water. I thought I could reason with my husband, but he was too enthralled by her presence, a father blinded by the chance to rewrite their sad history. Then one evening, while I was in the kitchen, I overheard a snippet of their conversation. "She doesn't like you," is all I could catch, and then my husband's laughter, the sound grating against my instincts. I felt invisible, like a specter lingering in an abandoned house, and everything culminated when I returned home one day to find the house eerily silent. My husband was gone, and so was Lily. Panic gripped my chest like a vice as my calls echoed in the empty halls. The air thickened with uncertainty. Suddenly, the front door swung open. It was my husband, disheveled but alive, and behind him, with a faint glow, was Lily, holding a crude, dark drawing that depicted me, lifeless, under ominous clouds. My heart sank as I noticed her smile was replaced with a sinister, knowing grin as she said, "I told you he'd come back for you." That night, I sat trembling in bed, too terrified to sleep, the drawing propped open in full view, wishing with all my heart that this nightmare was just a figment of my overactive imagination. The atmosphere swirled with tension and malice, and each time I turned over in bed, it felt like eyes were watching me, waiting to collect something that had been promised long before I came into the picture. When dawn broke, the reality of my situation struck me, and for the first time, I wondered if I was making a mistake by refusing to take responsibility for the child who seemed to pull our family apart, knowing all too well that ghosts aren't always literal, sometimes they are very, very real, and I had become the woman caught in the suffocating grip of a sinister pact, wondering if I, too, would be forgotten like the countless characters in the tales that had begun to seep into my mind, hoping desperately I wouldn't become a warning for someone else in the dark. When my fiancé, Tom, and I decided to move into our first home together, I imagined the smiles, laughter, and warmth we would fill it with, but everything changed the day I voiced my concern about his cousin's girlfriend, Clara. Clara had always rubbed me the wrong way, her laughter too loud, her words too cutting, and one particularly unsettling memory of a family barbecue haunted me. She cornered me, her cold eyes glinting with mischief, and whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear, about my past struggles with anxiety, painting me as some fragile, broken person. I brushed it off back then. Family dynamics can be complex, and feigned a smile while the red crept up my neck. But as moving day approached, I felt a creeping dread about the idea of her plopping on our new couch, treating our space like her personal stage. So, in an attempt to safeguard our peace, I brought it up to Tom, explaining how uncomfortable it made me to think she'd feel entitled to our home, that I just didn't want her to bring her drama and condescension into this new chapter of our lives. To my shock, he looked at me like I'd slapped him, his brows knitted in confusion, as he insisted that family gatherings were meant to be inclusive, and Clara was part of that family, and somehow it spiraled into a heated argument where he accused me of being controlling, selfish, not understanding the importance of his family to him, and in that moment, I felt the weight of isolation as he doubled down on inviting her, claiming I was overreacting, that I was the one causing a rift between us. I found myself in the eye of a storm I couldn't comprehend, where my feelings meant nothing, and he chose blood over the woman he was supposed to love most. It shattered me, and I felt like a villain in my own life, a true the fiancé versus the cousin's girlfriend tale playing out in a twisted sense of irony, and I thought of the odd glances she wouldn't hesitate to throw at me whenever Tom wasn't around, her calculated remarks piercing like daggers, but I kept quiet. When moving day arrived, the last thing I wanted was conflict, so I plastered on a smile and welcomed the chaos that came with a dozen family members stepping over boxes and trailing dirt onto our floors, but deep down I could feel that storm brewing. I'd already warned Tom, hadn't I? As the day unfolded, the house buzzed with laughter and chatter, and amidst the crowded living space, there appeared Clara, strutting in like she owned the place, her outfit representing some twisted version of classy. I felt an unsettling heaviness in my chest, and I excused myself to the kitchen for a moment of sanity, hoping a few deep breaths could drown out the noise. I poured myself a glass of water, feeling the cold glass against my sweaty palm when suddenly Clara appeared at the door, leaning against the frame with that same mocking grin. "Aren't you tired of pretending to be the perfect fiancé? Or does he not mind that you're really just a little weirdo?" she said, taking a deliberate step closer as if to intimidate me. Panic bubbled within me, and all the moments I had held back came flooding to the surface. I blurted out that she was unwelcome in our home. Silence. The kitchen, once filled with the scent of garlic and roasted chicken, turned so still it felt like I had yanked out the air from the room. Time slowed as her expression shifted, eyes narrowing, lips curling into a smirk tinged with malice. "You really think a little boundary will save you? This is not just your house, this is our family, dear," she hissed, emphasizing the word "our" with venom that sent chills down my spine. It was at that moment, watching her intense gaze penetrate through my facade, that I realized I had inadvertently wedged myself deep into a battle I was bound to lose. The wall between us felt insurmountable, and when I finally emerged from that kitchen, it was to a scene that felt surreal. Tom caught in a web of confusion and frustration as Clara spilled the beans about our little confrontation. The smiles turned into whispers as a funeral-like hush descended over our guests. I could see some looking at me in pity, others stunned, and the dagger of humiliation plunged deeper into my already frayed nerves. It felt like I was standing on a precipice, the ground trembling beneath me, and in a split second of sheer panic, I realized I was not the only one threatened by this shattering tension. Tom's eyes flashed with anger, disappointment, and betrayal, and before I could explain, I felt the cold weight of the room's judgment tighten around my throat. He turned to me, voice low and trembling. "Why would you do that? Why would you make a scene?" It struck me like a slap in the face, heartbreaking because this wasn't about me being the focus of the drama. I had only been trying to set the stage for a peaceful beginning, so why couldn't he see that? Determined to resolve the chaos, I tried justifying my feelings, asserting my need for boundaries, but all I got in return was the flicker of anger in his eyes, a refusal to understand. Clara was still smirking, her victory evident as she leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, soaking in every moment of my humiliation. I felt as if I was the intruder in my own life, torn between my love for Tom and the need for self-respect, my very existence reduced to a battle over territory, and I finally spoke the truth, that I wasn't comfortable with Clara slipping in and out of our lives like she was a part of the furniture, and that anger transformed into terrible isolation as Tom stepped back, shaking his head, whispering that I didn't know how to play nice with family, that I would always be an outsider to his world. The words pierced deeper than anything Clara could have said. I stood there, wrestling with waves of despair, realizing the nightmare was not just her presence but the fact that I was losing him. It felt surreal in the aftermath as people hovered awkwardly, unsure whether to support me or defend him, the tension strangling the air, collapsing my hopes of love into ashes. I tried to refuse Clara's smug smile, but the reality sunk in like the darkness gathering around me. This was never going to end well, and as the night dragged on, I watched Tom grow more frustrated, more distant, and I realized that in trying to stand my ground, I had unwittingly dug a grave for our relationship, slowly trapped in a dissonance that had settled over both our lives, one that made me question if I was the villain or merely a puppet pulled by strings of a vengeful fate. Now the boundaries blurred, and all I could wish for was to rewind. Instead, I found myself waking up in our new home alone the next morning, losing sight of the dreams I once had, staring at the walls which felt less like comfort and more like a cage filled with memories of regret, uncertain whether Tom would choose to fight for us or slide into the shadows, where Clara lurked, waiting to further her twisted campaign against the fragile remnants of what remained of our love. It was just supposed to be a casual night in with my friends, sitting on the couch while we binge-watched old horror movies and made jokes about the cheesy effects, but everything shifted when Lynn, my closest friend, leaned in with a mischievous grin and said, "You know, watching you two is like watching a really intricate roleplay," and for a split second, I started laughing, not because I thought it was true, who would seriously think that? But more because the idea struck me as absurd, like something ripped from the pages of a bad fanfiction. My boyfriend, Jake, chuckled too, more out of awkwardness than agreement, but when I looked at Lynn, her expression changed from playful to something darker, almost predator-like, and in that moment, I felt a chill skitter down my spine. I shrugged it off, dismissing it as one of her quirky comments at first, but the laughter died in the air, replaced by a heavy silence. I didn't realize it then, but my laugh had unearthed something buried deep within the group, like invoking a slumbering spirit at a seance. The night progressed, filled with laughter over bad jump scares and popcorn fights, but every so often, I'd catch Lynn staring at me through the flickering light of the TV, her gaze intense, almost conspiratorial. As the clock struck midnight, the final film ended, leaving echoes of creepy music lingering in the air, and we all decided to call it a night. I started cleaning up the mess, tossing empty snack bags into the trash while Jake and Lynn chatted in the corner, and I could tell something was off. Lynn's smile had morphed into a smirk, and I felt that familiar unease prick at my skin, a sense I couldn't quite shake. Later, as Jake and I were getting ready for bed, I joked about Lynn's comment, playfully nudging him, "Maybe we should, spice things up a bit?" But he didn't laugh. Instead, he frowned, his brow furrowing. "What did you mean by that?" he asked, and I felt a rush of confusion. Wasn't we on the same page? I told him I was kidding, but then he shifted closer, scanning my face. "You didn't take her seriously, did you?" The weight of his gaze pierced through me, and a strange dread curled in the pit of my stomach as I denied it, even as I recalled the glint in Lynn's eyes. The next day, Lynn's texts were as animated as always, but beneath the surface, I could sense something off, like frayed wires on a live circuit. When I met up with her later, I tried to broach the subject lightly, but she dismissed my concern, her laughter ringing too loud, too haunting. The following months became a looping nightmare, where I'd catch Lynn watching me with an intensity that made my heart race, each encounter steeped in an unsettling tension I couldn't comprehend. I'd hear whispers behind my back, hushed tones between Jake and Lynn whenever I left the room, and Jake had begun to change too, his jovial demeanor shadowed by an underlying paranoia that echoed my own. Our intimate conversations grew strained, and he started to echo my own worries back at me. Was Lynn really just a friend, or had I become a pawn in their twisted game? The realization that Lynn had crossed a boundary I didn't fully grasp gripped me like a vice, and unease morphed into outright dread as I pieced together that her ramblings about roleplay might not have been innocent at all. One fateful night, driven by a mix of fear and determination, I decided I had to confront Lynn. I needed to know what was going on behind her mask of friendship. I invited her over, pretending to keep the atmosphere light, yet when she arrived, I could feel the storm brewing beneath our pleasantries, her laughter shrill and forced as I coiled my fists against my trembling legs. "What did you really mean when you said we were role-playing?" I pressed, and her expression flipped from playful to predatory, the corners of her mouth curling into that tight-lipped smile I'd come to dread. "Oh honey," she said, her voice sickly sweet, "you're the one playing a part, but the script was never given to you. You're just too naive to see it." My heart raced as I felt the air grow thick with something so palpable, it bordered on tangible. Every warning bell I had ignored screamed in my head, and I tried to excuse myself, to reclaim my sanity, but as I turned to the door, I could hear her murmuring my name, each syllable laced with something darker. The following week twisted into a surreal nightmare. I started to see shadows cast from my past interactions with both women seep through the cracks of my whitewashed reality, memories warped and rewritten. I catch Jake staring blanks at his phone, brow furrowed, whispers weaving like spider silk between Lynn's oddly timed texts and his own responses, and the intimacy we had shared dwindled to cold, vacant exchanges. I tried talking to him about it, about how Lynn was siphoning energy between us like we were puppets strung along by her whims, but each time, he'd grow defensive, lashing out as if my concerns were unfounded, and I found myself backed into a corner, racked with doubt, as if I was losing both my boyfriend and my own sense of reality. On a particularly agonizing night, exhaustion overtook me, and I collapsed into a restless sleep, plagued by eerie dreams where I was an actor trapped in a puppet show, a caged bird pecked at by invisible threads pulling me into darker depths. I awoke with a start, and for a fleeting moment, the haze of the dream lingered, and I felt compelled to check my messages. The screen glowed eerie in the dark, and as I scrolled through the texts, dread coiled like a serpent around my heart when I discovered an unexpected text from Jake, "Meet me at the old playground," and the timestamp sent a shiver down my spine. It was sent during the night while I'd been dreaming. My heart pounded in my chest as questions overwhelmed me. Had they been plotting against me? What role had I been cast in? I grabbed my keys, driven by an impulse that propelled me forward, the shadows closing in like a muffled silence. The playground loomed in the distance, cloaked in darkness, and each step felt heavy, weighed down by foreboding whispers. As I arrived, the air turned thick and clammy, veiled in a chilling mist that whispered my name. "Jake." I called, but the night swallowed my voice whole. I turned, searching every silhouette under the moonlight, and then I saw her, Lynn, standing there, and in a heartbeat, I froze, terror gripping my throat as I felt an icy blast of realization. It wasn't Jake waiting for me, it was her, and the glint in her eyes confirmed the role I had unknowingly stepped into was far from innocent. "You finally made it," she said, her voice a twisted serenade that shattered my resolve. "I've been waiting for you." The darkness enveloped me, and I was left suspended in a nightmarish tableau, understanding too late that the laughter I once shared had been merely the haunting echo of a sinister game I never wished to play. I never thought I'd have to justify teaching my daughter the importance of sleep, but the day I found myself sprawled across the living room floor, heart racing and eyes wide open, was when I realized everyone views the world through their own lens, even my 8-year-old. It started innocently enough. Mia was a bright, curious kid who preferred late-night readathons over the weaknesses of sleep. She'd marathon Magic Tree House stories until the early morning hours, and it didn't help that her school started later in the day. I was worried, of course, but I never thought her nightly habit could twist into something darker until I started seeing the whispered shadows creeping around our home late at night, at first, mere figments of my imagination, a trick of the moonlight. But soon, I began to hear them too, soft whispers in the dark, grating against my sanity like nails on a chalkboard. They'd slither around my ears and seep into my dreams, taunting me with secrets that rattled my bones. I tried talking to Mia about how her late-night escapades were weaving a web of sleeplessness, but how could I compete with the enchanting stories she conjured in her imagination? One evening, desperate for a solution, I devised a plan. I would create a reward system for her to go to bed on time, embellishing it with the promise of being more energized and focused during the day. I thought I had struck gold when she eagerly agreed, all while those shadows shrieked in amusement, relishing in my naivete. The first few nights were a struggle as Mia cried for her books, but eventually, she started accepting her new bedtime. It all peaked when I noticed the whispers still darting around me, telling me it was too late to reverse everything, that maybe I should let her stay awake so they could find her, an absurd thought that sent a wave of anxiety crashing over me. One night, the tension reached its breaking point. I had just finished reading to her instead of the usual bedtime story. It was a thrilling old fairy tale, a diversion from my own creeping dread, almost lulling me into a trance as I tucked her in. But as I did, I saw the shadows cast onto her wall, impossibly long and grotesque, almost resembling hands trying to grab her. It was ridiculous, terrifying even, yet mesmerizing. My heart pounded in rhythm to the whispers, the urgency palpable in the air. "She must stay awake, join us," they seemed to chant. I flipped on the nightlight, banishing the darkness to its corners, and she squeaked out a frightened "Daddy, are they coming for me?" My laughter cut through the air, a desperate attempt to cloak what I felt was creeping closer, but there was no hiding my terror from her wide, unsettling eyes. I spent the night monitoring her, a pit of dread building as I realized the whispers had become frantic, feverishly relentless, urging me to let my daughter know she was safe, but I felt increasingly uncertain of my own sanity. That was my breaking point, and in an act, Of desperation, I whisked her away and enrolled her in a sleep training program I had read about online. They said it would teach her both the importance of sleep and ensure restful nights. But the horrified look in Mia's eyes, begging me not to leave her during our first session, tore me apart. Yet I pressed on, my mind firmly convinced it was for her own good, for a small sense of normalcy. Sessions churned into weeks, and while Mia took her lessons to heart, I was left spiraling deeper into sleepless desperation. Each night felt longer, and the whispers invested more time in raking my mind over the coals of dread. She doesn't need you, she'll choose to join us soon. It haunted my dreams, transforming her laughter into disturbing echoes as I tossed and turned in worry. I desperately reached out to other parents, but in our social media group, my pleas were met with laughter. Come on, it's just sleep. You are not being called to join the Sandman, they chuckled, but each laugh cut deeper until their amusement morphed into derision. Before long, they had tagged me as the overprotective dad who couldn't let go, further isolating me. I deployed strategies I'd learned in my own sleep-deprived state, led by what they advised rather than what felt right. I pushed her limits, enforced rules, and even barricaded her bedroom door with pillows, a move that causes waves of shame to ripple through me now. That night, the shadows slipped under her door, engulfing my household, murmuring vehemently, and I swear I could see them reaching for her. Tina, my wife, had long since given up. To her, Mia's sleep rebellion had graduated into another anecdote from a baffling father. I could hear her whisper late at night, "You're being overbearing," but every absence of sleep kept straining at my desperation. One fateful evening, the whispers crescendoed, echoing through the walls, and in a moment of sheer terror, I rushed into Mia's bedroom. The room was dim, illuminated by the pale glow of the moon spilling through her window, and there was Mia, soundlessly sleeping, but the voices screamed louder, almost erupting from the very corners of the room. She must choose, she must choose. In an act of panic and fear, I picked her up, shaking her awake, shouted for her to get up. It's important she stays alert, but my wide-eyed daughter crumpled in protest, her face stricken with fear. I was thrust into the horror unfolding before me. The shadows coiled tighter around me as I cradled her, horrified at how they began to flicker in the corner of my vision. They wanted her. In an all-consuming frenzy, I dropped her back on her bed and slammed the door shut, gasping for breath as if I had disrupted an ancient ritual. Had I doomed us both? The next morning was met with a silence that pinched my conscience, and when I approached Mia's room, I found it empty. My heart plummeted, 1,000 terrified thoughts racing through my mind. I dashed through the house, frantically searching, but the only noise that greeted me was the echo of my breath against the walls. It was then that I remembered the voices saying they would wait. Her door creaked open, and I felt their presence encircle me, still lingering like an unshakable chill. I tore back to where the shadows had taken me, and my hands fumbled to pull open the old closet door, revealing only impenetrable darkness, and there was Mia, but caught in a trance, a pitiful expression on her face. I would pay any price to pull her from that abyss, back into my arms where she belonged. When she returned to me moments later, her eyes focused once more, I held back my tears. It was all my fault. I had taken away the only shield she had against the shadows, her bedtime stories that filled our lives with imagination and warmth. As I cradled her, I made a decision. I would let her have her stories once more, even if it meant I could never truly sleep again. The importance of sleep suddenly became the echoes that trailed behind us, a gentle reminder of what dreams truly held. Though I still yearn for quiet nights, I realize the cost of my lessons was far too high. Am I the jerk for trying to teach my daughter the importance of sleep, or have I simply opened a door I can never close again? I never thought refusing to babysit my niece would lead to such a haunting series of events, but here I am, fingers trembling over my keyboard, desperate to share what transpired. It all began with a simple family gathering, my heart warm from the laughter and the clinking of glasses, until my sister, Lily, confronted me. She didn't care for the way I brought my boyfriend, Jake, around. She said it was inappropriate, like a circus show crashing into a serene family picnic. I was blindsided, and feeling cornered, I snapped, telling her that I wouldn't stand for her judgmental attitude and her constant need to control who I bring into our family's space. She retaliated by demanding I babysit her kids that weekend, as if promising to take care of her children hinged on my compliance. I returned home in a rage, refusing to justify myself further. A cloud of tension hung over my mind, but I convinced myself it was just typical family drama and that things would blow over. However, that very night, I received a call from my brother-in-law, frantic and nearly incoherent. He said something had happened, that the kids weren't behaving, and Lily was off the deep end. Wordlessly, I felt the shadow of dread creep in. It turned out he was wrong. Lily had taken the kids to a local fair, and when she didn't come back, well, the phone calls began flooding in. Hours stretched into what felt like an eternity, my stomach knotting more tightly with each unanswered ring, until they found her car abandoned in the parking lot, the engine still warm, and the haunting echoes of laughter from the carnival turned into sirens and chaos. It was only after frantic searches that they found her 3 blocks away, screaming at the top of her lungs, but not for help. She was screaming at her kids, who stood there, petrified with wide eyes and trembling limbs. The problem? She claimed she had seen something dark and lurking, something that she insisted was trying to get them. It wasn't just a skit, it was real to her. The way she talked about it, like it was a relentless predator stalking the shadows, had everyone on edge. It landed her in a psychiatrist's office, the official diagnosis being acute stress reaction. She could no longer care for her kids without assistance, and that's when the guilt hit me like a freight train. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I should have just sucked it up and done my part while juggling my own feelings about Jake. Instead, I'd stood my ground like some stubborn rock while she spiraled into the unknown. It didn't help that the kids became more withdrawn. They wouldn't speak about the fair or even look me in the eye anymore. So, feeling responsible, I offered to step in on weekend babysitting duties to support her recovery, but the atmosphere felt heavy, thick with unfinished chords that resonated unanswered questions. I began to notice strange things happening during these sessions. The kids would stare at empty corners of the room, whispering things I couldn't hear. Their faces turned pale as if they saw memories of something wicked, and one evening, while I was trying to distract them with movies, I caught them doodling in their coloring books. One innocent scrawl read, "It saw us." I brushed it aside, chalking it up to vivid imaginations, but then I heard soft thumps coming from upstairs when nothing was up there. My heart raced. I pushed through the fear, convincing myself it was old house creaks. But when the children's laughter turned to sobs, and they refused to go near the window, I decided I needed to confront this terrifying new reality. There was a lingering chill each night, and as I'd watch the kids fall asleep, I'd scour every inch of the house trying to find traces of what had stolen their joy. Then one night, while flipping through channels with the twins snuggled under blankets, a local news report caught my attention, a witness account claiming in the area, and I swear to you, it was the exact description of what my sister had said she saw. Something with long fingers and a grotesque face that would make shadows tremble. Feeling sickened, I dismissed it as coincidence but couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching me. I called Lily, her voice muffled and terrified, begging me not to let the kids go outside alone, and suddenly, everything spiraled out of my control. I thought I was doing good by stepping in, but it only worsened. The kids' nightmares turned real, and they refused to stay in their rooms, screaming about the thing in the shadows whenever night fell. I tried to reassure them, but all they could talk about was how it knew where they were and how it wanted to take them. Every night, I'd hear the soft whispering and see shadows darting past the corners of my vision. I was sleepless, frantic, and terrified. Months went by and therapy didn't help Lily, and when I finally stole a moment to lay out everything that happened to my boyfriend, Jake, he listened, shaken but resolute, telling me we'd investigate the house. The moment we walked into that living room, I caught Jake watching the children out of the corner of his eye, murmuring, "It's just an illusion." I had hoped he was right. I couldn't bear the thought of the monstrous beliefs consuming my family. So one evening, armed with only a flashlight, we ventured through the attic, but all we found were old boxes and dusty memories until an unearthly silence hung in the air. I flipped the switch, and together, we felt the temperature drop, hardly a breath could be heard, and suddenly those whispers kicked in more clearly. In sharp clarity, I felt it wash over me, an overwhelming sense of dread cementing my feet to the floor, and Jake jerked back, his face paling as he swept the beam across the shadows. And there it was, lurking in the edges, a twisted shape standing tall, fingers stretching impossibly long towards us. I wanted to scream. My instincts yelled to run, to grab the kids and flee, but in that moment, terror froze us in time. The thing whispered a name, my sister's name, and I realized then that it had wanted her all along, wanting to drag her into its world of darkness. That's when I heard my niece's voice, soft, innocent, and oh so familiar, calling me from downstairs, begging me to come play. I snapped awake from my horror, clutching my boyfriend's arm, and somehow rushed down the stairs, screaming for the kids to get away from the windows, but the room was empty. Silence smothered me alive, and when we managed to tear ourselves outside, a suffocating realization washed over me: the children were gone. Lily, lost in her own hell, and my family fracturing from the inside out, while the shadows grew ever longer. So now I sit here, sleepless, haunted, wrapped in both guilt and unanswered questions, because the thing that took my niece, that thing that chased echoes across our lives, had started as a mere judgment at a party, spiraling into a nightmare I never wanted to be a part of. AITA for refusing to babysit when I had no clue it would unravel into a much darker unfolding? A few weeks ago, I found myself embroiled in a family feud that spiraled so quickly into something inexplicable, it still sends shivers down my spine. My cousin Amelia, who is a year younger than me, had a tendency toward excessive socializing, practically inviting half of our high school to any gathering we had, regardless of the time or place. But this year, Thanksgiving was at my parents' house, and after nearly 2 decades of noisy celebrations filled with the smell of turkey and pumpkin pie, I had my fill of her friends slumped on our couches or rummaging through the fridge, oblivious to any boundaries. So, when she announced excitedly that she was planning to invite her entire friend group over for Thanksgiving, I snapped. I told her she couldn't do that. "Amelia, this isn't a party, it's Thanksgiving," I said, my voice a mix of irritation and concern. With tears threatening to spill, she stormed off, muttering something under her breath, and I thought little of it at the time. Yet soon after, the atmosphere around the house shifted, as if a thick fog had rolled in uninvited. I dismissed it as the usual family tension, until the day before Thanksgiving, when everything escalated dramatically. That evening, I was alone in my room, scrolling through social media when I heard an unsettling sound, like the distant echoes of laughter and mingling voices, muffled by the walls. At first, I thought it was just Amelia, and maybe her friends had come over anyway. So I crept down the hallway, pausing at the top of the stairs, when suddenly, everything went silent, replaced by the haunting clang of silverware dropping to the floor. I think it's worth noting that it was almost midnight, yet the dining room lights flickered as if someone were playing tricks with the switch. Out of curiosity and more than a little fear, I tiptoed down, half expecting to find my family enjoying some last-minute preparations. To my utter confusion, the dining table was set for an extravagant meal, plates stacked, candles burning, but no one was there. A chill crept up my spine, and I suddenly felt like an intruder in my own home. I felt compelled to call out, "Hello?" But the words barely left my lips when I saw the centerpiece, a grotesque arrangement of wilted flowers, and beneath them lay a note in Amelia's unmistakable handwriting: "You shouldn't have done that." I froze, heart pounding, convinced it was some cruel prank. I backed away slowly, intending to bolt upstairs, but as I turned, I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow flitted past, quick and darting like a live thing. My instincts screamed for me to run, but I found myself paralyzed. It felt as if I were awaiting something profound. When I finally gathered the courage to rush back to my room, I slammed the door and locked it tight, hoping that would be enough to keep whatever I'd just witnessed at bay. That night, I hardly slept, plagued by uneasy thoughts filled with what festered between Amelia and me. The morning of Thanksgiving dawned gray and heavy, the air thick with an odd sense of dread I couldn't shake. As my family began to arrive, I tried to put on a brave face, forcing myself to engage in the usual small talk. Every now and then, I would glance toward the front door, half expecting a bustling group of Amelia's friends to barge in, but they never did. A creeping confusion and guilt gnawed at me as I remembered Amelia's tear-streaked face, that feeling of something undisclosed shared in those fleeting moments before she left. But when the dinner bell rang and we settled at the table, there was an emptiness around us that felt wrong. I hadn't noticed it before, but Amelia's absence cast a shadow over everything. Her seat lay conspicuously empty, and as the food was served, a hush fell over my family, like we were missing someone vital. I tried to swallow my unease, laughing at my uncle's jokes while the rest picked through their food absent-mindedly, eyes darting toward the door as if expecting Amelia to walk in with a smile and an entourage. But she didn't arrive. During a quiet moment, I ventured the question everyone seemed hesitant to voice: "Where's Amelia?" My mom stiffened, and the air soured. "She canceled last minute," my dad muttered, eyeing me as if I were the cause of this mischief. A suffocating silence followed, and just as I thought the tension might snap, my younger brother piped up, "Hey, isn't that her car?" Our gaze turned toward the window, where the faint, unmistakable outline of Amelia's old Honda sat in the fading twilight. But Amelia didn't emerge from the vehicle, nor did anyone else. I felt a pang of worry shoot through me as I realized besides that strange note, I hadn't spoken with her since our argument. Just as I was about to suggest we check on her, a sudden shudder rattled the house, and the lights flickered ominously. For a heartbeat, everything went pitch black, and I could hear the muffled panic inside the house, my family's voices blending into a chaotic symphony of fear. When the lights returned with an angry flicker, our eyes found the windows, which revealed a reflection I'll never forget. There, pressed to the glass, was Amelia, her eyes wide and frantic, mouth moving as if she were screaming. But the sound. It didn't reach us. In that horrific moment, I felt something wrench inside my chest, a sense of cold accusation settling firmly in my gut. I didn't know what I'd unleashed by saying Amelia couldn't invite her friends. I lunged for the door, my heart pounding, but before I could escape, the house became agonizingly still. Drawing in a breath, unsure whether to feel more terror or dread, I realized something was terribly wrong, as if an uninvited guest had slipped silently into our home, something that lurked and stared from the corners of our lives. Thanksgiving dinner turned into a nightmare, family gathered around shivering in silence, while outside, the world was hushed, and the only sound was the echo of Amelia's voiceless scream. I never went outside that night, I was too scared, paralyzed by the unknown lurking just beyond the door. The next morning, without any explanation, they found Amelia's car empty and her gone, no trace of her anywhere. The police didn't find a single clue. As days blurred into weeks, no one ever spoke of her disappearance, and when I finally gathered the courage to ask my mother about her, all she would say was, "You shouldn't have asked her not to invite her friends." When Thanksgiving came around again a year later, the dread returned, settling on my shoulders like a curse. Amelia was gone, and I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, it was all my fault. Even now, as the holidays draw near, I can't look at the empty chair where she used to sit at the table without feeling an icy sensation clawing at my insides. You might think it's just the guilt, but deep down, I know it's more than that. Those shadows cast by our family dinners have grown darker, something unseen digs into my gut, festering with secrets. And even today, I still hear her laughter echo through the walls, diluted yet almost tangible, taunting me like a warning of what happens when you tell someone they can't invite their friends for Thanksgiving. I never thought a simple trip to the store would turn my life upside down, but here I am, staring at a deliberately cracked rearview mirror and my shaking hands as I replay that day like a broken record. It was a Thursday afternoon when I made my way to the local grocery store, the kind where you can already smell the fresh bread wafting through the air the moment you step inside. I parked my car, a rickety old hatchback that sometimes felt more like a death trap than a mode of transport, and grabbed my reusable bags, satisfied at the thought of stocking up on supplies for the week ahead. As soon as I stepped out into the sun, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, but I shrugged it off, I was just being paranoid. As I navigated through the aisles, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, I felt an odd sense of unease gathering in the pit of my stomach, like a storm gathering clouds, but the distraction of choosing ripe avocados kept me focused. Then, just as I was about to pay, the store manager, a burly man with a thick mustache, confronted me. He pointed an accusatory finger and demanded to know why I had parked in the customer parking lot despite being a non-customer. My heart sank as I stammered out an explanation, grappling for words to deny the absurd claim. The truth was, I had shopped there plenty before, I was a loyal customer even if I wore the same ratty hoodie every time. But he wasn't having it, and soon enough, a crowd gathered around us like vultures drawn to a dying animal, some taking pictures on their phones, others whispering behind their hands. I felt my face burn as outrage and embarrassment battled inside me. I tried to plead my case, but the manager's eyes were void of sympathy, and he kept saying I had stolen a space meant for paying customers, almost reveling in my unease. The chatter swirled around me, and through it all, I became acutely aware of the other customers' judgmental stares, their silent alliances forming against me. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I whipped around to see a stranger who claimed to have witnessed everything. The wrinkle-faced woman looked deep into my eyes and said she had seen me walk into the store without a cart, evidence of my guilt, she implied. Before I knew it, I was in a full-blown confrontation, surrounded by angry voices as the scene devolved, and I felt trapped in a surreal nightmare where all I wanted was to grab my groceries and leave. I thought I would cry, the humiliation of it all, so I decided to cut my losses and walk away. But before I made it to the door, I heard a loud shout that made me spin. "You think this is okay? You think you can do whatever you want? It was a younger guy, he must have been no older than 25, and he was practically shaking with rage. My instinct told me to just leave, yet I felt a compulsion to respond. "I can park anywhere that's not specifically marked," I said, my voice tinged with desperation. "I'm a customer." Somehow, the words fell flat, and within minutes, I felt like I was the villain in a crime thriller. People were snapping photos, and I couldn't help but feel like I was reshaping their perception of me into something monstrous and self-serving. Heavy with the risk of escalation, I bolted toward my car, but the crowd followed me, whispers morphing into accusations, and I could hear the word entitlement thrown around like a weapon. My shaking fingers struggled with the keys, the metal digging into my palm like the weight of the judgments surrounding me. In that moment, a primal panic kicked in, and I took off, barely managing to slam the door behind me before revving the engine. I glanced in my rearview mirror, the crowd dwindled but still, those eyes followed me as I sped away, fueled by something more than just righteous indignation. I thought about what they believed of me, a thief in plain view, a villain unseen until I was thrust into the light. I had an incessant feeling of being stalked as I drove home, every car a possible threat, every intersection a heightened crossroads of shame. By the time I reached my neighborhood, the weight of my crime settled heavily on my shoulders, pulling my spirit down. I locked the door behind me, determined never to revisit that store again, but the fallout was far from over. Over the next few days, I watched anxiously as the topic spiraled on social media. Someone had posted a video of the confrontation, painting me as a monster in need of public scorn. The comments were merciless, people calling for my head because of a miscommunication blown out of proportion. I struggled to sleep. Images of that mob haunted me as I tossed and turned, each creak of the house sending jolting terror coursing through me. I tried to remain disconnected, but it was impossible to ignore the shame, the anger, and the community I thought I belonged to suddenly turning their backs on me. I stopped going out, avoiding the grocery store like it was a plague zone, but I still heard whispers as I passed others in my neighborhood. Then came the calls. I got them all right, late at night just as I was starting to succumb to the silence of my home. They were taunting, anonymous voices echoing the very accusations that had attacked me days prior. I blocked number after number, but they kept coming, like a relentless tide, washing over me, burying me in guilt for something I had believed was just a simple parking dispute. I no longer found joy in cooking for myself or curling up with a good book. All I felt in the pit of my stomach was an ever-gnawing shame that clung to me like a shadow, relentless and suffocating. I began to question my own sanity. Had I really parked illegally? Did my neighbor slip the manager my license plate? The whispers grew louder, and they felt like the predator closing in on its prey. Then one night it all came to a head. I found myself pacing the floor, drowning out the voices in my head. I had to know the truth. The next day, I ventured out once more, heart pounding like a drum but determined to confront my fears head-on. I needed to know if it was true or just a horrible delusion created by my escalating paranoia. I parked in a remote corner of the lot, hidden behind a line of bushes, and I watched as the store, the employees, the manager, the customers, all of them went about their business, seemingly unaware of the nightmare that they had thrust upon me. It was then that I saw her, the woman from that day, her eyes scanning the parking lot, locking once again on a car that was far from mine. I noticed something was off, a slight look of satisfaction overtaking her usually neutral expression as she walked toward the store. She turned and looked right in my direction, but I was smart enough to stay hidden. In that haunting moment, I understood, this was never about a parking lot. It was about a power struggle, a humiliation that they sought to inflict on someone who didn't fit their ideal of a perfect customer. I got back into my car and drove away, heart racing, but deep down I felt empowered. I finally had clarity of a sort. Perhaps I could never return to a place I loved, but now I knew, I was never going to be their scapegoat again. In lieu of acceptance, I chose to carve out my own reality, for whatever it was worth. As for the accusations, AITA. Well, maybe parking in that lot was the least of my sins, but now I'm focusing on how to rise from the ashes of a grocery store confrontation that left me feeling more human than ever.